he's kind of pushed against the notion that like, no, I didn't really start the EU. It would have already happened without me. So you kind of did though.
You did
You
though,
did.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, he is, as
Yeah,
Matt said, he's the Lucino of his day. He's the
pretty
proto
much.
Lucino of the Star Wars universe.
I've said it a million times, the dialogue for all of these characters and the way it's written is just fantastic in this
It,
book.
it it really is. I keep saying it feels like that continuation of the originals. This is the natural sequel to the original stories, and I think that's the highest praise we can give, really. Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome back to Fanalysis Star Wars. I'm Callan. This is Matt.
Hey guys, welcome.
Yeah, and this is Evan.
Hello, everyone.
Today we're going to be discussing Heir to the Empire. Take us away, Evan.
In terms of what this book represents, this is more or less kind of where the EU as we know it originated. There were works before this, most notably things like Splinter in the Mind's Eye or even some of the original Han Solo trilogy. But in terms of a more cohesive, interconnecting universe with, like story arcs, original characters, it essentially all began here. And talking about it now, I think it's interesting because when I went back and reread it for this review, I was actually shocked at how well it held up. Not that I was expecting it to be bad, but you can see how so much groundwork was laid in this piece. It's really fascinating. It really does feel like, reading a piece of history in terms of just literary presentation. And um, even though there are certain aspects about it, which we'll get to in this review, of course, that, may or may not hold up in the way we expected, just even looking back on it now, it's still incredible. So, Callan, shall we move into how each of us came to this piece?
Yes, yeah. I mean, for me, it was probably similar to how most people found it. This was obviously, and still is, to be honest, for the original material anyway, it was the first on every list for where to start with the expanded universe. I remember when I was starting to get interested in looking back or looking into, the larger Star Wars lore. Besides those random books you kind of pick up as you go along growing up. I remember
Mhm.
I looked back and figured out the first ever book that I had read was. The name has escaped me again, the bastard. Damn. One of the Jedi Apprentice run with Siritachi and Adigalia as the mains, or at least more central to it.
Oh, the one where they have
For years and years and
dim
years, I
light on.
solely remembered it based on the cover as being that first ever Star Wars book I picked up and never knew which one it was. And then years later, I looked back to find out which one it is and have forgotten it again since. Anyway, Thrawn was basically the first book I actively decided to kind of, okay, I'm getting into this world now. I'm going to expand my Star Wars universe lore. How do I do that? And everything on the internet is obviously pointing this direction. And as you said before, there's a good reason for that. It's the foundation of the whole of the modern EU, really.
Mhm.
It's springboarded the kind of expansion of the lore behind the scenes. It feels, as we'll discuss, very naturally like the natural successor to the originals. It's the sequel trilogy we never got in film form. It's flawed, as again we'll discuss, but for me that is the highest praise I can give it. It feels like a natural continuation, not just of the story, but more importantly the characters. No one in this
Mhm.
book, to me, feels even the slightest shade out of character. Not only the characters we knew before from the originals alone, but the actual natural extension to them 5 years down the line. It's very, very difficult to write developed characters that people have come to
Yeah.
know and love while adding that dimension of change, successfully. So hats off to Timothy Zahn for the solid execution of that, in my opinion. But yeah,
Yeah.
it was the first on my list. I picked it up. I never looked back. It was the perfect springboard into a larger world.
Yeah, I'm actually someone on the opposite end because I came to this book relatively later in terms of like my EU sort of journey.
Hmm.
So, even though, I had read even I had read post Return of the Jedi material before I even read this. So, going back and even seeing the origination of some of these characters, it was very interesting because like you have to kind of I remember very distinctly having to like put my head back into like, oh no, like, Mara Jade doesn't act like this because she hasn't done this yet, or Han Solo doesn't make reference to this because, oh, that hasn't happened yet, when I originally read it, of course.
Hmm.
um I will say too, though, despite it very much being, a jumping off point, even though like I said, I did go back and read it relatively later. I was very much amazed at how just nicely it slots back into things. Yes, certain continuity, again, as we'll get to, was kind of either shaken up a little bit or just retconned entirely. But even despite that, like I said earlier, I really was surprised, even when I originally read it, just how well it holds up. There is quite a bit of, like, you can very much see the literary influence from other, even non-Star Wars works that Timothy Zahn was clearly inspired by when he wrote this. But even just as a pure piece of science fiction, when I first read this, I was very impressed. And like you were saying, Callan, it's not easy to have such a significant time jump for these characters. But to add on to it, I was also very surprised how well Timothy Zahn integrates his new characters and making them
Absolutely.
feel like they were always a part of this universe, and slot them in a way that really, really feels natural. Characters like Thrawn, characters like Pellaeon, characters like Mara Jade herself, character, even Joruus C'baoth, like, you know even with all of the added continuity that came later, it really does feel like these are characters from the same franchise that you're used to. Especially, back when this was originally published, the amount of, extra material was fairly limited. So again, just hats off, like you said, hats off Timothy C. Zahn, because, it's not exactly an easy task to do what he
This
did.
this book did a lot of the heavy lifting for some of the mainstay names we know post this.
Yep.
Not just the characters, but simple things like Coruscant as a planet, and the just the nature of the direction the Empire takes as an organization. It does mainstay names like Sluban shipyards as well. There are things in here that just become part of the setting, and they do so because this book did such a good job of breathing life into it. What about you, Matt? How did you come to it?
More similar to Evan, but coming at it from the opposite end of the EU, I think. I
Mm.
knew and still know fairly little in terms of intimate detail about like what goes on in the post Return of the Jedi period. I was never terribly interested in, I don't know. There's something about what there's something about when you start with a character like Luke, at least when I was younger, I didn't really want to see him get old. I didn't want to see him as a
Mm.
Jedi Master. I wasn't interested in that. I just wasn't. And so I knew that eventually he starts having like, a family of his own, and he starts becoming seen as sort of the Yoda of like the day. And that's all appropriate. I'm not saying that any of that's poor storytelling. I just didn't want to see it. And then there was also we've referenced this a few times, but like I've never really liked what's it called actually? I'm having a Dark Empire where like Palpatine comes back, right?
Mm.
Dark Empire, yeah.
I've never liked that. I've never liked recycling the same old sorts of setups to continue telling a story. I prefer that stories end. I think that they kind of get into like a soap opera comic book itis kind of a tone where we're just reusing the same old ideas over and over again. And I knew that that was a part of the post Return of the Jedi era. I knew it wasn't all that. I knew there was good stuff there, but I always was fairly. I don't need this. Like I like Han, Luke, and Leia, and Chewie, and the droids as they were when I left them. I don't need to see that. Uh, my perspective on that has changed over the years for a couple of reasons. Not least because of what we've had in place of that
Suddenly, that's starting to
ever since.
smell a lot sweeter after the sequels
Yeah.
came out, despite flaws that are present.
Yeah,
Because I
I
also
don't.
don't like Dark
That
Empire
one.
as well, for the record. That's one thing I've never even really delved into. It's a big black spot for me
I've
in
I
I've
knowledge.
I mean
noticed
it,
I've noticed some people
yeah.
don't like it when we say that. They want us to explain that. I don't. I can't really explain a distaste for something after. It's just a question of taste. It's like I don't
Mm.
like that. There's a very dated aesthetic with that. It goes beyond just the style choices or like the stylized way that the art was rendered. Just the way certain characters are dressed. It looks very sort of
Mm.
like punk, and just kind of
It's
different. It's not for
yeah,
me.
yeah. I've always had a soft spot for certain aspects of it, but I
Hmm.
agree that aesthetically and just presentation and even the overall concept, it is a very strange sort of watermark in that
Yes.
particular era, especially since so much of like you said, so much introduced in that story really doesn't really appear later on.
Mhm.
I think that's
Well,
by
things get
design,
referenced.
or not by design of it, but people coming afterwards, they kind of
Things
got
get
that same
referenced,
sense
of
as
course,
us.
but it's
Yeah.
like, it is kind of surprising how relatively little from that era, because there were 3 volumes, so it's not like
Yeah.
insubstantial, but most of what kind of influences later stories is very much like, I don't want to say window dressing. I mean, things like the Ossus, library and all that. Like, obviously, that was a big
Mhm.
part of rebuilding the Jedi. Cam Solusar, was one of his first students and all that. But again, that's all very settings based. So yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. There are, like I said, like for me, it's like there are aspects of that story I enjoy, but I acknowledge that it is horrendously flawed.
I think it's the key premise
Yeah, and
behind it as well. Emperor coming back, Luke being partially turned,
That
all that stuff.
that was
Those are
always going to be a
things.
difficult
Yeah,
sell.
those
Yeah.
are things I think most writers, leading up until the sequels anyway, would decide were not good ideas. And so they once they had control
Mhm.
of the influence themselves, they steered away from it and tried to
This
sort of ignore it for as much as possible.
Yeah, this isn't really a justification by any stretch, but like that particular story arc did have quite a bit of meddling behind the scenes when you look into
Mm.
what Tom was like as far as direction goes. I'm not saying that justifies what happens, but that is something that I
yeah.
think is worth at least bringing up. He was
Yeah.
very much
But
he was very much like kind of led by, I don't even want to say led by the nose. That sounds too harsh, but there was a lot of mandating with certain things with
Yeah.
that. So
But that's a
sure,
topic
sure.
for another day anyway.
yeah, I
Sorry,
know
I
And
that.
sidetracked on that
the
one. But yeah,
reason
go back to your point, Matt.
the reason I bring that story up and others like it is that it always kind of felt to me as like, and again, bearing in mind that I was criticizing from a position of ignorance. I didn't know what actually happened really, like in these stories. I was looking at it and going, this looks like you're forcing the characters we know and love into another catastrophe or another circumstance or another just to give them something to do. And to me, it was always so hard to go bigger than the Empire and Vader and the Emperor. So all these other characters, they just didn't quite, or these other scenarios, I should say, didn't ever quite feel worthy of my time or attention or of the characters themselves in some ways, depending on which one we're talking about at the time. And it wasn't that I didn't want their stories to continue. I was just always like in my head, they went off and did this. Like in my head, again, I was a kid, when I was still
Yeah.
doing some of this stuff.
Of course.
I would rather have told the stories, and whenever I would get the loose premise of there was this that happened, I go, I don't like that. In my head,
Mhm.
this is what Han did afterwards, that kind of. And then when I found out things like how Chewie died, I was like, okay.
Oh, we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, things like that, right? So, I'm mentioning all these things. I know we're talking about Heir to the Empire, but it was one of the last major works that I actually rolled around to because I didn't really start committing to like proper attention paid to the EU until like somewhere around, I would think probably around 2002, 2003. It would have been after like the Attack of the Clones film had already been released, and I'd kind of like I dipped a toe into it before that, um, for sure, because that was during like the Phantom Menace era. I was very much invested in what you were talking about just a bit ago, Callan, the Jedi Apprentice
Mm.
kids books. They were novels, but they were meant for kids, but they were very well written for what they are.
Very well
And
written. Yeah, we'll have to discuss them at some point.
I had done books like Darth Maul Shadowhunter, for example, which we're going to get to fairly shortly here on the channel, which provides just such a great look at Coruscant specifically from multiple different perspectives. I had already played and loved and had my just mind changed by Knights of the Old Republic for how like what you can do with storytelling. That is to me, it's in the same era as you were getting things like the Lord of the Rings films being released, for example. You know what I mean? It was a time of like, I'm just kind of becoming aware of what I like about fiction rather than just this was a cartoon that I watched and it entertained me for a time growing up.
Mm.
I was starting to think, what is it that has staying power? What is it that actually molds and changes your mind? What is it that matters? What is art about this? What is artistic about this? Um, and those are questions I'm not saying I have definitive answers for, and there's only one way to think about them. But that was the burgeoning of like my engaging with any of that. You know what I mean? And so I'd been through all the good stuff already, pretty much by the time I picked up Heir to the Empire. And by the time I got it, and here's another thing, I had a slightly adversarial reaction to it for the longest time because I would say things and you referenced this in one of our talks recently, Callan, the notion of what people regard as canon and how much
Mm.
that matters,
Hmm.
or when or why, especially now in the post handing it off to Disney era. Um, but for my money, it always was the same question, and it never really mattered that much because I would say things like, if somebody asked me, who's your favorite Jedi or your favorite story, I might say something. I might talk about the events of the Jedi Apprentice series. I might talk about Knights of the Old Republic. I might mention Darth Maul, Shadowhunter, and Darsha Asant and all the rest of it. And they'll say, "Well, that's not canon." And I said, "I don't think I care." And then you would get a slightly different person who would say, "Well, the only work I think should be canon is the Thrawn trilogy because that was so good." And I just thought, okay. And so there was like this really like hyped to the nth degree because this first book was released the very year I was born. I was born in 1991. So obviously I wasn't aware of what was going on in the zeitgeist, sort of like when it made the scene. But I kind of consider it belonging to the generation slightly before ours in terms of
Mm.
its like massive impact. It was their KOTOR, for example. Like you know what I mean? It was
Yeah.
their Lord of
Yeah.
the Rings trilogy. I understand that. And I don't think that it is unworthy of that in any way, shape, or form. But by the time I got round to it, it was just another really, really, really well written work of the EU, but not singular in any way, shape, or form. I love the way that it's true to the characters, as you mentioned a while ago, Callan. I love the scope and scale of what he was able to, Timothy Zahn to say, was able to like bring to the table in terms of kind of painting the galaxy in a vivid way and adding so much that has stuck around, and just rising to the challenge of that, as you kind of spoke to, in your own way, Evan. It's like I admire all of that, but it's something I kind of have a little bit more of a, I feel a little bit like Thrawn in saying I have a little bit of a clinical like perception of it. It's like I think I understand it fairly well and I appreciate it, and there's a lot I really like. I have never adored it. I have never considered it the only work of the EU of such high quality. I have never really like needed it or felt it was necessary, but I really kind of, my mind has, if I've changed in any way, it's only because it is so very good in comparison to everything we've had since around, 2008 or so, with the exception of maybe a couple of books like Plagueis and Tarkin and the odd straggler here and there, and a couple of series like Andor or whatever. You know what I
Mm.
mean? But it's other than those things, um, I mean, my expanded universe experience was always great, for the most part, and this was just a part of it. I never looked at it as the one singular work that mattered. But I love it, and I don't want to deprive it of its credit where it's due or anything. But that's kind of my relationship with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's
I think
interesting
I
because
think you made a lot of good points with that though.
sorry, you go,
Like
Evan.
I'm oh sorry, yeah. No, I think you made a lot of good points with that. Like I'm on a similar boat in ways is like I think I appreciate this work more so for what it represents and what it really did for like the franchise and the fandom and just the public perception overall. Um not to say that the work itself is by any means negative. I
Mhm.
don't, none of us are saying that this is still a absolutely fantastic piece of literature, but like kind of like what Matt was saying, I'm more like appreciative of like, hey, this is the jumping off point. This is, without this, so much of what I love and what we all love might have never existed.
Mhm.
So you can't help but really just love it for that alone. And even though again, like I wouldn't put it in my top 10 personally, that is by no means, a detriment to the work itself. It's just that certain things that came later I felt like improved upon what this initially introduced, but that does, by no means make it an unenjoyable experience.
Yeah, and I think what we're mostly speaking towards, like you mentioned it briefly there, Matt, is that generational aspect. We were
Mhm.
a generation behind this book's release, so we were coming to it either from an academic perspective or a one piece among many, or just like for me, it was obviously the starting point. So I probably have a more emotionally favorable response to it just from that alone. But
I'd like to say on that
yeah,
point, if you belonged to that generation slightly before ours, where you did not know that you were ever, ever, ever going to get another Star Wars film, and this came out, I mean, I don't really think that you could ask for better than this. I mean,
mm,
it does fulfill that mission like to the T. You know what I mean? I get that completely. Um, it's finding it in like a post prequels era, pre sequels kind of, and for me, almost as a capstone piece. Something like Plagueis obviously was conceived as kind of that. It kind of cemented every story and tied them all together because that's what Lucino does.
Hmm.
But this is like it. I can see it for what it was, even though I found it way late in the game for it to be that for me. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
I don't deny that that's what it was. It did sort. I think the author has even kind of been humble, and I don't know if he's just being polite when he says this, but he's kind of pushed against the notion that like, no, I didn't really start the EU. It would have already happened without me. So, you kind of did though.
You
You
did that,
did.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Yeah,
And like
yeah.
we said, there
You
were other
kind of
it
did.
works that
existed,
did
it
good
existed
things, but
before then, but it's like,
yeah, there are
yeah.
other works that did good things, but only one series or trilogy or one book, whatever it ended up being in any reality, only one was ever going to be the spiritual inheritor of the originals, and this is it. Actual modern day canon sequels be damned. This is the sequel to the originals. If you it felt I mean, we talked about going back to it and being surprising how much we enjoyed it, Evan, at the start there. I was surprised at how cozy this book rather felt to me. Obviously, it was the first of among the first books I read from the EU, so it's got that kind of starting point experience to it that it wasn't the same for you two because you'd had more knowledge of the other earlier era in world later release books. But even factoring that in, I'd come to know that some parts of this book were dated in style, some parts were dated original canonically, because of things like the fact that he didn't know, and no one knew, what was intended behind the Clone Wars, things like that, etc. We'll touch on that, where that kind of flair. That's not really a problem for the first book of the trilogy, it's more for the second two, but that will come up and we'll discuss that later. But even through all of that, I was surprised by how cozy it felt coming back. It felt very much like coming home in a way that was true of Dark Rendezvous when we reviewed that. I didn't expect that to hit as much. It may just be because of the fresh wave of love I've got for Star Wars again from the originals. When I read this book, I hear the John Williams soundtrack playing. It feels like I'm watching a cinematic experience just in the book formats, and that is a very difficult thing to write. Period. Let alone for Star Wars. Particularly at a time when there was basically no other Star Wars around. He really does deserve the title of the kind of first step of Tolkien of the world.
Can we talk about why that is, like without going into like all the plot structure just yet or
Yeah,
anything
for
like
sure.
that? Like, I think it's since he's done this, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people have come in and tinkered with characters over the years. Like added their bits to this or that Jedi or that bounty hunter or whatever, out of all the different eras. What is it about this that? Because I agree that is one thing. That's one way in which it refuses to age poorly. It's got that timeless connection to that Star Wars feel. What is that? Like why does it have that in your guys' opinions?
It's you
I
take away
think
that
a
first,
lot of it
Stephen.
comes down to like tone and presentation, and also just the writing style that Timothy Zahn kind of goes about it. Just a lot of the freight, at least, again, for me, like the reason it really feels that way is like the way he writes very much feels like the sort of dialogue you would see in the films or you would see in other EU works at the time. And I think, because Timothy Zahn has even said in the past that, like, he did a lot of, well, research for this book. Understandably, he was a massive Star Wars fan, even, well before he had been asked to write this. So I think also too, it's like the way that one of the things that made particularly the original trilogy so memorable, I think, for a lot of people is that, each character, each setting, each planet, each sort of, situation felt like you were just stepping into just a small fraction of such an expanded, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but a much larger universe. But at the same time, they were memorable enough to where you could connect like that character to this point to that planet. And I feel like that really comes off in this book as well, because like when you think Thrawn, at least for me, it's like I think of like him on his like Star Destroyer, him surrounded by like his Noghri and his like stormtroopers, that feel of the Empire that honestly very much reminded me of like Tarkin and Peter Cushing's character in A New Hope, that sort of imperial sort of presence Where at the same time you have, Han on the Millennium Falcon talking with Lando and Chewie. You get that sort of swashbuckling, sort of like, hey, let's go on an adventure sort of feel. And then obviously you have Luke's sort of dynamic with learning to expand his Jedi abilities. Very much feels like to me like, oh, we're back on Dagobah, or we're back on Tatooine. Like I think his writing style does a really, really good job of sort of capturing those little snippets in time and setting that the original trilogy did so well. At least for me, that's why it really feels that way to me in this book.
Yeah,
Sorry if that was a little
no, I agree with that. Jumping on that point,
it's not the
I
easiest
think,
thing to describe, honestly.
yeah, no, I think the way he's achieving that, because I agree that's the core of it. First of all, his dialogue is front and center to me. That is the linchpin behind it all. He's writing perfect dialogue for these characters. It fits their character. It fits the development and the time since the originals have come out in world. He's nailing every single aspect of that just throughout the entirety of the book, with like one or two exceptions for each character, maybe. It's very rare that I get like a bit where that was phrased weirdly or oddly for that person. And yeah, we'll get to that at some point. But on top of that being the linchpin and kind of underlying everything else, on top of that, and this is the key thing that maximizes that strength for me, is that his prose is very light. It's extremely well paced. He's clearly fine tuned different sequences to match the kind of the cinematic feel he's going for in how it feels like the story is progressing. But the prose is not ever flowery or particular. Not to say unartistic, because it's very well done, but he's not resting the strength of the story in the way he's delivering the prose. It's very much you can just scan read it, go, and it will flow off the page into your brain very easily, resting on the strengths of the characters and the story that we've come to love, and like I say, channeling it through the dialogue. That was something I remembered about the book, and having known the perhaps more prosily focused stories that we've talked about on the channel for the rest of Star Wars, knowing how much we love that style of language within the world of Star Wars, I thought that was something that would maybe be like, yeah, not the greatest strength of the book for me going back to it. But that wasn't true, and I think that speaks towards the strength we're talking about here, Evan, with what you're saying. It delivers the original experience because it makes it more. It's not about the art style of the format. It's about delivering the story of Star Wars in book format. This could have easily been translated into a script for a film very easily.
Absolutely.
And played that way. It feels like he's framing the story as a film rather than a book for me. Obviously at greater length because you have the time to do that in a book, but it could be easily be truncated down in a very good format, a very short order.
You mentioned the dialogue, and I think that is probably the best thing about it in terms of how he's able to sell the idea that these are the actual characters. Because the funny thing is called the Thrawn Trilogy, and he very much is like the part of this that I think he's brilliantly well done, but there might be something wrong with me, my nerd soul. I don't care about Thrawn. I don't know what it is, but I don't get much out of him. You know what I mean? And I don't know exactly why that is. I don't think he's a flawed character. I don't think anything about that side of the writing is poor. But when it's Han and Lando and Leia, when it's Luke and R2, I mean, I think my favorite line in the book is probably, "I like marketplaces. I like them a lot." I mean, that just sounds like Han. Like I can hear Han doing that, and it's specifically Han, not just.
I was about to say he's
Harrison
the
Ford.
strongest. Yeah, he's the strongest voice for me in the book. Not that the others are done poorly anyway, but I think he's probably one of the hardest to channel consistently, especially once you've taken the development into consideration. Because some of the stuff he's doing is a lot more above board, professional, mature in this story. He's clearly come a bit into his own outside of his old swashbuckling self to an extent, but all of that underlying core of the character is still there in the wording, in the phrasing of things. You can read his lines and you know exactly what the delivery would be by Harrison Ford in executing them. It's how Han says that line. You know how Han sounds when he reads that out. It's very
also
strong.
just how how he gets okay, I get that there's like a setup here and you're trying to shunt me off here. Like, no, I'm not going there. I'm going to pretend that I love shopping. Like we all know that there couldn't be something further from the truth. He doesn't need to tell us that. He knows we know that Han doesn't like that. He knows we know Han. And he's talking to us with like a kind of shorthand that I think makes it feel close and like familiar. And that I think he does I won't say better than every other author. I don't know, but as well as anyone does, you know. And so that I think really helps. Because I mentioned it, I think we've gone far enough without talking about the actual character of Thrawn himself. I think
Mm.
we ought to discuss that
Mhm.
because I mean it when I say I don't think that there's anything wrong with how he's been rendered. I just think it's kind of a taste thing for me. I don't know that
Mm.
the character can be more than what he is meant to be. I don't know that there's anything I could be given that would make me like him more than I do. But very much, I view the whole thing as just a vessel, a vehicle for the classic gang to be doing something together again. My mind has never been blown by him, and I feel very much like an out, like an odd man out on that one. But if we could speak to Thrawn as a character, I think we ought to.
Yeah, I think you're right on a lot of points in the sense that like I think he's a fantastic villain for this particular story in the way that they sort of, really want to tell it, but at the same time, I think, for me too, it's like even accounting for the rest of the EU, it's his actual sort of how do I explain it? His actual sort of like, backstory is and how he kind of became the way that he is always sort of it's touched upon, but at the same time, he's generally treated, at least to me, like a vehicle to further other narratives, which
Hmm.
isn't necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, like even in something like Outbound Flight, where he's also featured very prominently, he's meant to be like the setup for, what happened with C'baoth, and obviously foreshadowing the Yuuzhan Vong and the Chiss Ascendancy and all that. Whereas with this novel, again, he's very much taking the reins of the Empire, so our original crew have, a villain to fight. And because of that, I wouldn't say that makes him come off as bland because he is the furthest thing from bland. But at the same time, I don't feel like he really shines on his own as much as someone like Vader or someone like the Emperor, really, really do, even discounting the old EU. Because it's like, just watching the original trilogy, like you can imagine that like people like the Emperor and Vader, like, oh, they have so much, like they could easily headline their own story, without being connected to any of this. Whereas I think Thrawn, as he's presented in this book specifically, just doesn't quite feel that way to me. But again, that's not a
Well,
knock against the character. It's just it's all structural, you know.
we've been friends for a very long time now, and times do change. But when we first met, Callan, like this was like your go-to character. He's almost all you talked to me about when
Yeah,
we first were meeting. So what do you think of him?
he's always been. I agree with both of you. I think it comes down to be how much you get from him comes down to kind of an ice cream flavor thing. He's most interesting through the apparatus surrounding him and the parts of the story that he influences and is most connected to. For example, the Imperial Navy's kind of aspect of stuff with the officers and how they're interacting with the war as a whole. The way we're presented his personality and his perspective on this, how that manifests in the story with simple things like officers talking to each other on the bridge, the military strategy against the New Republic, etc. All of that stuff. If you're not particularly interested in that as a subject matter within the world, which a lot of people aren't, then most of what Thrawn's going to bring to the table for you just isn't going to hit the same way. For me, I've always been interested in that. The Navy aspects of Star Wars has always been one of my
I
favorite
don't
parts.
Mhm.
I don't think
That
that's what it is for me though, because I don't. In other words, that's it, on its face when you just say it like that. There's nothing unique about him.
hmm,
He is very much singled out as like the officer, the imperial officer, the grand
yeah.
admiral, the reason why we know that title pretty much. What is it about him that takes that to the stars for you, or beyond your common garden variety moth, say?
It,
Like what
it
is it about
well,
him?
first of all, it certainly doesn't these days as much as it did back in the day. I've encountered more characters of his type from other works at this point. So the scale to which I elevated him in my mind, which wasn't massive back in the day, but was definitely worth noting, has diminished. But even saying that, I still enjoy him as a presence in the story. I still find him engaging. I like the choices that were made in presenting kind of his perspective. things like the art. It's obviously at a certain point it comes across very much like, okay, it's basically just doing magic and how it's reading an entire
Magic.
culture.
Yeah.
It's
Um,
you can't
See, that's
read.
something. Since you brought that up, I was going to ask about that later, but since you brought that up, that's a common critique, or it has become a more common critique in the time that in the time since I've been made aware of the actual goings on of the story. The occasional blip of like, I don't like this book is usually to do with that kind of which I think is a very much a rare opinion, by the way. But I mean, what you do see people say he's basically just doing magic, or I'm not sold on his ability to do this. I have never particularly minded that. Like
Yeah,
that's not really what I mean. It's and I don't want him to be a Sith. I don't need a Sith instead. I guess maybe it's a question of motives rather. I mean, like, is there anything interesting about what he wants or why?
we don't really
In
know
my
it.
mind, I
That's the
can't.
main thing. We and by the end of the story, because he's obviously such a cold and clinical character, not that that's an excuse for it, but we don't get to see that underlying drive for him, why he cares about what he's doing, why he's as driven as he is, why he's as involved in the resurrection of the Empire in his own mind. That's a weakness, I think. I think we should know more about that, particularly given the fact that he's the titular, character of this trilogy. If he was just another run-of-the-mill villain of the week, it didn't need to be done. He's executed very well at that level. But because he is supposed to be the vocal point of the trilogy, I agree that there should have been more for that. Speaking to the art
It's
aspect
the one
itself,
thing.
that never bothered me either.
Yeah,
But I can
yeah.
understand a few, again, in the stories themselves, particularly throughout the trilogy, I can understand a few blips where people think, okay, that's ridiculous. For the most part, it was a very well executed idea. I like the concept. I just think you can't be someone who's, oh my god, it's genius the way this was done. It's amazing. There isn't enough connecting lines between what he's seeing in the
I
art
think
and the actual story aspects. It's a vehicle and an idea to kind of get across his intelligence without actually outlining every aspect of the story every time it comes up. Pellaeon being another great method of delivery for that, because having him as a POV
Pellaeon
instead of being
is a more
in his
memorable
mind is
character
very
to me,
clever.
I was about to say,
yeah.
I was about to say, like to your both of your points. I think Thrawn works best, honestly. I think Thrawn, Pellaeon, and C'baoth actually works best in this book when they're like all together as the like ensemble villain sort of cast, because they all have such different sort of personalities and motives behind them that when the three of them are together, it creates this very unique dynamic, because they're all kind of playing their own game their own way with their loyalties, their ways of
I
thinking, their ways of
I agree.
managing. I think that honestly is when all three characters are most interesting in this book, when they're all together. So I think,
See,
and
See,
I think actually that saves all of them collectively in this book, because I think when they're each on their own, to me they're not as interesting, but when they're together it's like perfect,
See, I agree with that, with the added spice of personally having zero interest in C'baoth. Like, C'baoth to me is only here because you need a Jedi aspect to the story, something for Luke to do in the background. For
I
most of the
consider
trilogy.
him. I consider him like an active
hmm
like a bit of a slog.
Mm,
I have never liked him. You know what I mean? And at the same time, it's I agree that they do work well together. Without that dynamic that you're talking about, there would be no excuse for him being in the
Right.
book for me, like in my
mm.
opinion. But C'baoth, aside from little thing, I don't even like his name. I like just
Yeah.
little things. I don't like anything about his character. But he is, I think, probably the most obvious relic of not quite knowing what the Clone Wars was going to be, which
Yeah.
Timothy Zahn couldn't have known. No one
Right.
was ever allowed to touch those. That was like a Lucas directive. You can never touch those. I don't believe for 1 minute that he knew what they were when he first wrote
Mm.
the term. I don't believe that at all. I mean, when after the Phantom Menace, like stills of the Attack of the Clones promotions would come out, and you would see Ewan McGregor on Camino and not know what it meant, and it was enough for people to go, "Oh, all the clones are clones of Obi-Wan." It's like, well, I hope not. That would be the most ridiculous thing. You know,
Well,
um,
It's problem with any clone story, really. It goes straight back to this clone
ironic
saga, doesn't it?
considering C'baoth almost ended up being a mad clone of Obi-Wan Kenobi.
exactly. And I think that was part of what people were grasping at was, is this how we get to Sabayoth, and is
Mm.
there something to that idea, or are we resurrecting that idea, or and it turns out they were all clones of some Mandalorian, which is arguably also a dumb idea. But I mean, the Clone Wars, you would think probably the clones should have been the antagonists as opposed to a bunch of industrial droid like armies. You
Mm.
know what I mean? And then that way you might be able to conscript soldiers to fight for a cause that you could conceivably care about. I have never
I
understood how it is that people do care about the clones. I think that that's mostly from the cartoon, but good for you. I don't understand that. But anyway, Joruus C'baoth, I think, is definitely like a weak link here. And at the same
Mm.
time, I really only like the scenes that are between him and Pellaeon and Thrawn. Him and the Jedi, I don't need any of that. I I just find him almost. I don't even know if it's by design, but he's profoundly disinteresting to me. I don't
I,
need him at
I'm
all.
I'm with you on that. I
yeah.
understand why he's there. I mean, if not mandate, then Zahn just thought that he needed something for on the Jedi layer to be talking about. I personally think we
Mhm.
could have gone this entire trilogy without ever having to give Luke anything more than just being the military asset that he is in here. Just and then with the story, he could have just been fighting the Empire, and that would have been fine for me. But for people who think that there should have been a Force element to it, I get why C'baoth had to be an element. I
Hmm.
wouldn't have included in the way they did. I've never really put thought into solving the problem of how to do it better because I just never really cared about it enough. You could just lift him completely out of the story, and everything good about the Thrawn trilogy remains as good to me. But I also agree with your point, that Evan, that they do work together as a three. I only brought up the Joruus point specifically there by itself because, to me, I find Thrawn and Pellaeon interesting alone, and particularly together as well. They don't suffer and require the three of them together for me for that to work. It's just the C'baoth side. He is
Yeah.
the thing about their dynamic that I most enjoy is Thrawn and Pellaeon's respective handling of him as a tool, which sounds very cold and clinical. But I like the one of the only
Because it
things that he
is.
delivers on is the
It's like
concept of the threat. He's a threat to them and their cause. And in the handling of him, just the way any Force user would be. I like the kind of the tension and the kind of tone that's called to and well handled there for me throughout the trilogy. There's a few moments where it's like, oh, if because of this, why would you do that? But they're very few and far between, and always, even in those moments of inconsistency for me, the feel is there. Like, you get that they're scared of this Force user, and it kind of touches on a little bit of that Darth Vader vibe. Never fully harnesses it, but sort of alludes to that they had in the originals and kind of replicates it here.
Yeah.
But on Pellaeon, though, I always found him interesting by himself. I think that the reason, and you probably think of this as well, Matt, that he's more interesting than Thrawn is the relatability. He feels much more, and obviously Thrawn isn't human, but as with always with Star Wars, non-human is still human in personality because that's how we relate to people as characters for the most part. But he's a more human character. He's someone who he has thoughts and feelings about things. His reaction to some of Thrawn's eccentricities, should we say, has always been amusing. The fact that he's like, why are you thinking this? I think you're putting too much stock into this. And, Thrawn always has an answer to it, but he isn't always right about it. And I like that. I think that Pellaeon's a really good lens to see into this character because it can be very, not just difficult, but very boring sitting in the mind of a character like that, because to be that level of genius, they have to see and understand things in a certain way that's very difficult to translate into thought and book.
Think
Yeah.
I think it's almost always a mistake to try to write a genius. I think that it's so easy to go wrong, just like or off rails like completely. I think I admire the choice to not be in Thrawn's mind, and that is kind of the only reason why Pellaeon's there is so that we understand like what's so we're able to filter it through a perspective. And yes, he is a more relatable one. I think I would like him to have a little bit more going on than he ends up getting, to be honest, because he is that POV character for us.
Yeah, most of that comes later after the trilogy.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah,
He becomes a lot more central later in the post Return
yeah.
of the Jedi era.
And when you mention things like Outbound Flight and all these other works, it's sort of like you would not have gotten those if it hadn't been for the fact the character was so popular, like of Thrawn and Pellaeon by extension has a continued role in the other works because people responded to this work so much. But and he is a good character. He's I suppose my favorite of the characters. That was created for this, or because of this. There aren't like masses of those, to be honest, I guess.
Even
I
more
mean,
than Mara. Interesting.
yeah, I've never cared that. I get that might have been mostly because I just didn't care about the main cast so much, like seeing their stories progress, and because of who she becomes to Luke and everything. I was always slightly detached from all that. Not to say that she's a poorly realized character, although it's always been funny to me how many people were serving Palpatine, like in retrospect.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
and
comes
it's only
after this for the
gotten
most
sillier and
part.
And
But
she
sillier.
was a
yeah,
nurse, so
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I'll give her that. It's even when you see her in things I like. There's something about the image, like in the arc or in the story where Vader fights Anya Kuro and kills her on that planet. Um,
Mhm.
the image of there being a meeting between her dressed in like a skin tight leather suit with Vader talking in Palpatine's like throne room is silly to me. Like I just I can't. You know what I mean? It's just so bizarre. I can't make heads or tails of that. She's not even wearing like something that looks more like an official outfit. She's just looking
Mm.
like, sexy stealth, femme fatale, and she's just there with like her red hair and like, yeah, I'm hot and everything. And she's like, the only people in the room are Vader and the Emperor. It's just so funny to me. I like her as a character. I just she's certainly not.
She's not been well handled by everyone that's had access to the character, that's for sure.
Yeah. To,
Pellaeon has character has scenes that I just like and respond to
yeah.
more, and also because it is very much a case of Hamill's one of those actors that really wanted to get the girl in the end and just was denied that opportunity. There are other actors who have been in situations like that, and Mara Jade's character kind of serves that role sort of posthumously almost for like the film's perspectives. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong about that, and I know that she gets I have read some of the stories. I'm not as blind to the post Return of the Jedi era as I was when as I was speaking towards the beginning of this talk. I've dipped, into some of those books, but I haven't like finished any of the series outside of like the actual legacy of the Force, which is not to be confused with the legacy comics. That's different.
Mm.
Um,
And that's
and
far from the shining beacon of post Return of the Jedi era, to say the least.
no, I like the legacy comics.
No,
Fate
no,
of the
no.
Jedi,
The
I
the
hate,
previous name,
but
just books.
oh, Legacy of the Force. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Yeah, those are after the NJO kind
It
of.
is. It definitely does a lot of this, but like to your point though too, it's like to me, it's like, and I'm not just saying this because he has a mustache, but I always viewed Pellaeon. I
Where are
always
we
viewed
going with
Pellaeon
this?
as in a second. I always viewed Pellaeon as
Let him
very much
cook.
like the Watson to Thrawn's Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
very well
okay.
put. Very well put.
All right. Yeah.
It is what
I
he
was going to
represents
say,
within the story. That's the mechanical role he serves, as Matt said.
But
He's the
yeah,
explanation and perspective of all of the master plans that we see,
yeah.
without having to have all of the master plans in the character's
But
head themselves.
But but to your point, like kind of like Watson and Sherlock, I like that it's very firmly established that he's actually very intelligent and very, very capable in his own
Mm.
right. They don't just use him as a measuring stick to show how badass Thrawn is. And there are times where he not only disagrees with Thrawn, but there are moments in this where Thrawn actually like defers to some of his suggestions, and
Mm.
you can tell that like Thrawn is not the kind of person who would do that unless the person making the suggestion is someone who A has a point and B has thought through it clinically enough to be like, oh no, that is actually a good idea. Let us do that. And I really like that because, like again, like going back to like, the Sherlock and Watson thing, like in the original Sir Arthur Conan Doyle books, it's actually established that like, in terms of like raw intelligence, Watson's actually not that far off from Sherlock himself. It's just more a difference in how they think. And I really like that. That's kind of the vibe I was getting from Pellaeon when he's with Thrawn, because the back and forth is so interesting. I'm glad that they didn't just go with the cliche of having him be both just for exposition and dang it all just for exposition and just as a measuring stick. He really does come off as very, very capable in his own right. And you get the sense, like, again, he's not really that far off from Thrawn, at least in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, he's lower rank. Obviously, he's less capable, obviously, and all that. But again, he's not just a measuring stick. And I like that because it could have easily come off as cliche.
I also like it's to the credit of both characters as well. It's not just a case of, oh look, Thrawn isn't like Vader or some of the other officers. He does listen to his subordinates. It's not just that, but it also shows that the Pellaeon's got a backbone. He's standing up to him. He's kind of testing the boundaries of what this new relationship is going to be moving forward. It's showing on top of that the kind of the shaking off of that dread that people like Vader had managed to establish in the Imperial Navy. It's not just a case of if you do anything wrong or if you ever question anything, you're instantly going to get killed like it once was. There's multiple different angles to how this handled. I know you're about to mention them, Matt, with the exception, and this is one of the only things about the book that raises my eyebrows.
Well, since we're talking around it, before we get to that point, we'll delve into the scene since you know where I'm going with that. But what I
Yeah.
was really going to say is like that's not to me the strength of it. It's the fact that he cares about his people and his
Yeah.
job and his position. Like that is what I care about Pellaeon. That's also the reason why I like Talon Karrde. You know, his people are
Mm.
important to him. You
Yes.
know, it's I because I don't think that Vader's incompetent. It's just but there does come a point where when he's done with you, he's done with you, and so is
Mm.
everyone else because that's the end of you, you know. But if you want to delve into that scene, I actually don't mind the scene, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it, in terms of how it actually goes down. Um, but what were you going to say? You seem to be
For the
teeing
listeners,
up a bit of a
scene, yeah.
pushback.
So I hadn't I don't recall having felt this way the first time I read the book, because obviously
I
what
was
this
going to
is
ask you whether it was
this
always a
scene,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
this scene is the one obviously that when the Thrawn turns to his subordinates and tries to figure out the nature of why the problem with the tractor beam went, or the scenario of the tractor beam went the way it did and failed. And obviously the Navy's expecting, oh god, Darth Vader moment, he's going to kill the person for incompetence. He goes and investigates. He investigates the officer, investigates his superior, and whether or not he's been trained correctly, etc., etc. Sets up the scene nicely, and obviously Noghri ends up killing the guy who was actually executing the device himself. Um, this is the strength of this is it's teeing up the follow up to the next book with the a second attempt that also goes wrong where he doesn't make this choice, and I love that. I think that idea is brilliant. I think in the second book it's executed perfect. I think this does as an idea is a good job for setting that up. But something on second reading that came to me as I read it is that for a long time, reading the scene, and it may just be because I was I suppose remembering the first time and remembering the second time and how it played out. You don't really get a sense for how Thrawn's thinking this through. There's not when he actually makes the decision to kill the officer through the Noghri. It to me the crux of that decision felt a bit vague, both in why he's thinking about it and why he's made that choice, and also which choice he's made. I don't know if that's something that anyone else has found when they've read it, but it didn't.
I don't think it's a. I don't disagree. I'm not sure it's a flaw. I think the implication is he wasn't sure what he was going to do until he did it. I think it's sort of because it is ultimately you can filter it through whatever logic you want. It's an emotional reaction.
Mm,
It's coming off. It's just like with Vader. It's always at the end of like a failure that almost like a near miss that
mm,
didn't that he feels is thwarted. So he's choosing to make an example of someone, and I think he was not sure which he was going to opt for, whether it was the ensign or the one who actually made the mistake.
Yeah,
But it's the error versus a mistake conversation. If we're still
yeah,
being too vague about it, that is how it's phrased. But that moment I think is you remember we talked in Plagueis how you felt the venomous lightsaber duel was almost like a point of mandate. And I personally didn't mind there because there are no other lightsaber duels in that
yeah,
book.
yeah.
This you could almost get the idea that okay, he's got to do something Vader like in this
Mm,
book because he doesn't really ever. And there does come a point where the book wants you, and I think it works very well to view him as sort of like a Jaws, like dun 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 dun
yeah.
dun dun dun. Dun. I mean, like from especially from like people like Talon Karrde who have to like host him for a meeting and kind of lie to him a little bit and hope that he buys it, and then know
Mm,
that can't really hide from this guy. He'll just come back, you know. Um, if he doesn't if he doesn't execute, like, you know, unintended, you know, like somebody, you know, or something like in response to something, you don't really have that
Edge of
vibe that he's a
danger.
threat.
yeah.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
Yeah.
also,
Completely agree with that. It was just and a choice to have it done. Completely on board with it. Particularly as I said that
Mm.
it tees up that much stronger second scene where he doesn't do it, and
Yes.
so
yeah,
Pellaeon makes the line. I can't remember exact wording, but it's like and with that he had them. You know, they had the loyalty of them all because they knew, oh, he's not a Vader. He does care about us. You know, and he's willing to
yeah.
Well,
treat
that
us with
by the way,
respect.
Well, and also,
by the way, since you can I just real quickly talk,
yeah,
the loyalty thing that
Mm,
like in universe, I think is kind of what has been. I wanted to mention this earlier. That's kind of been exported to out of universe. I think that that's the reason why the character has as much like sway as he does, is that
mm,
people do view him as somebody you don't because of what he's representing. It's a great idea, and I think maybe the greatest single conceit is the idea of like an imperial remnant that's not giving up the ghost just because, you
mm,
know, the emperor and Vader are gone. In some ways you could almost get into the thing I was critiquing at the start, where I'm not so into constantly recycling the same old ideas and going over the same old ground. But with a character like this who inspires that kind of loyalty, which is entirely contingent upon whether or not he's actually as competent as we're told he is.
mm.
Um, I think that that's the reason why he has as much pull as he does as a character, is because his own people can see uh maybe they certainly don't they certainly don't understand his reasoning behind everything, all his moves, but there's no doubt that he gets results, you know. So I think
Mm.
that that's one of those things where it's almost like, because the work is telling you he's as good as he is, it's good enough for most people. It's not for me, but because of the way that the characters do respond to him, that's what pushes it over the edge into an actually being a successful character. So
Yeah.
that's why, even though I don't personally vibe with him that much, I don't begrudge him. I don't think I said this. I don't think I made this clear. I don't begrudge him the reputation he has at all. Other
Mm.
than if it's taking you to the position that like it's the only good EU work, then I don't know
Yeah.
what you're talking about.
That's absolutely
Yeah,
But
insane. But yeah.
it's
you know,
it's well earned enough in its own right. And
mhm,
now that you mentioned the whole state of the empire and sort of the dynamic, I think that's going to be a good segue into like the actual
sure.
like first part of the book, because we open with, well, the state of the empire, and I really like, I think one of the big points of this, like the 5 year time jump after Return of the Jedi, and just seeing the state that the Empire and the New Republic are in, um, with Pellaeon's perspective of so many of the officers on his ship being, younger and not as highly trained as what he's used to, and using that as a lens for seeing how far the Empire has fallen at this point. It's a very, very strong opening, and then using that to immediately juxtaposition to the introduction of Thrawn. I think it's a really good way of introducing not only the state of your villains, but also their overarching goal in a very short order, because you see that they're desperate, but also not incapable. You see what they want to do, and you can also see why Thrawn is such a threat, because he's taking all of this not so much in stride, but you immediately get an idea of the character's standing as well as his overall goals. So it's very, very smart in the way that they do that. Um, because at the same time, it's like you don't feel like this is just like, oh, Return of the Jedi's over, Empire's gone, that's it. It's like, no, this is still a very, very razor's edge situation for the New Republic. And I think just as far as like tone setting, it's perfect, because 5 years is a pretty significant jump
Mm.
in time. So
It,
for them to get all of that really done in such short order is really fantastic. Now, granted, I'm not going to try and get too nitpicky with this, but this does lead us into our first kind of continuity flood, because Pellaeon distinctly mentions that he'd been in the Imperial military for something like over like 30, like over 30 to 40 years. But if
Well,
you look at the actual if you look at the actual continuity, the Empire actually didn't exist for that long. So it's a little
yeah,
bit
that again, as with many of the discrepancies like this, though, it can just be very easily written off as, oh, it was a Republic Navy he meant back then.
sure,
Because
and
we
I
have
think
that
he's
name.
that's exactly what I was about to say. That's exactly what it became later on. They established that Pellaeon in other work was actually a big person in the Imperial, Clone Wars. He served on various ships, and
I
even
think
at the behest
well,
of Palpatine. But like,
yeah, we
again, I just want to mention that, because there are some continuity flubs in this book, mainly revolve
I think
around time.
Mm.
there's a 15, I think there's something like a 15-year uh gap, a 15-year discrepancy between like when the Clone Wars period was supposed to have ended and what it
Yeah.
ended up being. So I mean that explains most things right there. And of
Mm.
course it is like it isn't to say ta-da, it's fixed, but it's an explanation. And if you're not willing to accept that as a reader, that's kind of your problem.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wrote it when he wrote it, you
Yeah,
know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's no secret at this point that Lucas initially envisioned, Obi-Wan and Anakin being at least a decade older than they actually ended up being.
Mm.
Like that's no, and then again, like again, that's nothing new in this franchise. I mean, look at Qui-Gon, the 60-year-old Qui-Gon Jinn, who was played by the, like, I think Liam Neeson was like in his 40s at the
40,
time.
Yeah. Something like
maybe
that.
Yeah,
early
Yeah.
40s.
this is
Yeah.
this is nothing new, but
This is all
it is
this is
something
all
worth
hand
pointing
wavy
out.
stuff that you can instantly forgive
Yeah.
any franchise, let alone one as expansive and reasonably cohesive as Star Wars was. But at the height of the EU strength, timelines are always going to be problems. Ages, dates, all that stuff is going to be the hardest thing to nail down in a universe that's expansive and handled by this many creators. And this was the first
He
foundational
wrote
brick
it.
that was laying down effectively at this scale. So he can be
Mhm.
forgiven for
He
all
he
of
he
these. Not even a
he wrote it in
breadth of complaint.
1990, or he wrote it in 89, released it 89, 90, 91. It was released in 91.
Mm.
He wrote
Nice.
it in like a pre home internet, world.
Hmm.
He was relying on like archives and information from editors and people saying, "Oh no." And he was also having to take a lot of chances and risks. I mean, Evan, you talk about the fact that people don't like some of his use of like hot chocolate and just
Yeah,
things
that
that are
was
in our
the
world.
thing that he
You
mentions
know,
in the comments.
Of all the
I
things for people
read
to complain about
the
in this book.
yeah.
yeah,
In the 20th
you know,
anniversary edition, it includes a lot of like comments from Zahn himself on various chapters and various points, and he actually mentions that he got hate mail because he included Luke drinking hot chocolate because they thought that was too
to
realistic.
Earthling.
And
Yeah, I
and
mean
yeah,
that's
but I love too his response though, because he even says like in his comments, but like, why would you want to live in any universe without hot chocolate? Like that's
Exactly, yeah.
brilliant,
It's
you know.
about calling to
Also,
mind the
brilliant.
idea of a comfort drink that he's drinking as a character. It's
Yeah,
about connecting relatability for the reader to the experience of Luke. It's if people can't understand
it's
that,
also
and
like
people have their opinions, but if they can't understand that, I think that he should not be worrying about them. As, as,
yeah.
there's a
as
difference.
readers quite
Also,
There's a
also,
simply.
it's
difference
hilarious
between
that like hot
there's
chocolate becomes something that Luke loves, like later
Mm,
on in
yeah.
the EU. It's hilarious.
That's probably
middle
to
finger, yeah,
people.
exactly.
Like, yeah, I mean, there's a difference between if a Jedi's walking around with like a handful of berries from like some bush somewhere, and if they've got your ice McLatte or whatever from McDonald's. Like,
Mm.
there's certain things that you just absolutely cannot have, right? But um, I mean, chocolate is chocolate. It's you know what I mean. It's a thing. It's like
It's
they have blue milk.
fundamental, yeah,
Okay, like
exactly.
I mean, they're having blue milk with breakfast. Is that not the only thing alien about it is that it's blue, but they're having milk with breakfast. It is what it is. It's the same thing, chocolate, same thing. So anyway, people the way like I said before, I don't understand the way some fans' brains work. But
Yeah, it's a
it's
little
very
odd,
true.
but we get the
But
introduction of Thrawn, and like we've already talked a lot about his character, so I don't think there's too
Well,
much
well,
to.
on that
right.
point, because I
I want
wanted
to
to
talk
mention
about
before, sorry, just because of the introduction you mentioned with the Empire as a whole, Evan, I just wanted to add on one more point. He brings the same understanding and exploration of and development of character that he brings to the actual characters, to the to the people in the story. He brings that same level of feeling, whatever you want to call it, that same level of truth to the factions as well. He's
verisimilitude.
yeah, exactly. Thank you. That's the
Yeah,
word. The Empire feels like
the
a character in that intro.
It's
It's the Empire
yeah,
we know, but it's reformed. It's got a different tone to it. It's got a different energy, and it's channeling through the characters that represented it. He captures that very
mhm,
quickly, very succinctly, and very effectively, and he keeps
yeah,
that
I
going
wanted
in a
to
solid consistency
yeah.
throughout the rest of the
It's
story.
I wanted to
and
talk about that with the way that he introduced the character of Winter, actually,
Mm,
because it's like it's you can't create a character like that and have her be thought of the way she is. I mean, like we're told that like Leia was often mistaken as being not the princess because she was in the room,
which
right?
I love that. I
Like
love that line.
that's enough of an idea to get just the gist of their whole friendship and relationship of what it was, but it also tells you everything you need to know about how a character has been perceived in a very quick amount of time. And you can't create a character with her, abilities and insights without giving thought to pretty much everything, like
Mm,
everything that matters. And there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. I wrong way would be explaining to me why the milk is blue. I don't care why it's blue. You know what I mean? It's like you can go off on a tangent with
Luke
things very
out.
easily, but a
mm,
character like Winter, I think, is very, very indicative of exactly what he does everywhere. That the card, the what is it called, a skiffer or
mm.
the card he uses to cheat, like
Yeah.
Han does. He created that. That wasn't a thing before that. Like all those little touches he's thought about. The way that the power cell from Luke's hand is used. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like later on, all those little things. It's okay. Just outlining all those details is the wrong way. Doing something with them and thinking about how they would be used, and finding an organic use for them in your story. He does that on like every page of these, and that I think he was like the OG Lucino. I mean, I think
Mm.
Lucino probably took it to like another level, just in terms of Lucino-ness, in terms of like he almost takes it too far. He almost goes into the direction
Yeah,
of what I'm
he
saying.
never
You know
does,
what I
but he's
mean?
always on the edge.
Yeah,
Like this is
Yeah,
yeah,
one
later
like
later
breath
that
too
one.
close to
yeah,
being too. He always rides that line perfectly. But
Yeah,
yeah,
but
you're right.
that
It's on
yeah,
the edge.
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
but like that intro, that takes us, like you were saying, Callan, to Coruscant, which is kind of our first major look at the planet, which obviously, as we know, George Lucas ended up, bringing into, the prequel trilogies. And it is very interesting, just we had no basis for this planet beforehand, and
Mhm.
the fact that they're still able to capture the feel of this massive citywide, plane is really really interesting. Um, Now to that point though, we also get to one of what I would consider one of the more infamous decisions that this book sort of introduces. I say somewhat because I feel like you could take it in different ways.
Yeah, I remember you
You
mentioning
basically,
this like way back in the day as being something you didn't
Ben
like.
Kenobi's final farewell to Luke. Um, I think I've always been of two minds about this because because even in the comments, Timothy Zahn says that he did this very specifically because he didn't want, he wanted Luke to be entirely on his own from, the sort of Jedi spiritual standpoint throughout this trilogy, which again I'm of sort of two minds about. I don't think it was really necessary, and it also and again, I like not to be the EU purist or anything here, but it does create a few continuity problems in terms of not only the Jedi spirits, lingering and whether or not they can, reappear at certain points and whatnot, but it also just sort of I don't know. It just to me this comes off as one of the most as very forced, and I
Mhm.
don't really think it really holds up as necessarily well as it should. Even disregarding all the continuity problems that it creates later, because it's like like Ben very poignantly says like, "Oh, I'll never be able to appear to you again." But then again, but then it's like way later on. At the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War, like Luke just straight up says that he hears Ben talking to him about something, and it's like, what? And
So
and
this,
it's
That's
or
not a
even later in this
continuity error. Luke's just going crazy, clearly.
yeah.
maybe it's like and then it's like you have other spirits that have like lingered for way longer than
Yeah,
Ben has.
for
Like, and for the record, him moving on is not really an issue, but the way it's sort of framed, like here's how I would have done it. If they had to do this with Ben moving on, I would have had it been not so much I'm moving on because I have to. I would have preferred it to have been I'm moving on because I choose to. Like that would have been how I would have done it. Like Obi-Wan's like I've done everything I can. I've trained you, I'm deciding to move on. That would feel more Jedi to me personally, and it would also sort of help with the continuity of other Force ghosts later down the line that we see sort of appear, like even disregarding Anakin and Yoda, like we other Jedi spirits and all that. That's how I would have done it personally. And again, like I said, the fact that Zahn himself has said that he did this on purpose to make Luke have to give Luke less support, it just feels it's one of the most forced parts of the book in my opinion. So that's how I would have done it. Sorry, just
yeah,
small rant
I,
there.
I, I think I'm more forgiving of it just because I mostly blame Lucas for this kind of vagueness about like what a Force Ghost is or what.
Yeah.
Because even with the prequels, he there always kept being like this idea, this notion you were going to get it. And the one scene is Yoda at the end of Sith goes, "Oh, I got training for you, Obi-Wan. You'll talk to your old master. Qui-Gon? Yeah. Okay. That's it, Like there's
Pretty
and
much.
then if you want to get into like what TCW and the more modern works have done with like the whole
oof,
idea of the
God.
wills of the Force and all that stuff, and I don't even want to talk about that. That
Yeah.
subject actively annoys me. But I blame most of that on just I think I understand his reason. I think is a sound one of like I can't just have the Force spirits bail him out all the time. I think what you're suggesting would have been one of a couple of different fixes that would have been perfect. He's just choosing not to, or if there's some kind of interference that means at times it's hard to, or he can't, or whatever, or maybe
Which we
there's something
see
up
in
with
Empire
Luke.
Strikes Back for the record.
Right, or if there's something up with Luke that he kind of falls out of harmony with the Force for a little while and he's not touching it, and also we have these things, these Ysalamirs that are introduced into it that also might be and also just the fact of like there might be a sense of I think I will also would have like it from a character perspective, Ben kind of like I mean it's spoken to with like lines like you're not the last of the old but the first of the new. I,
Hmm.
I
Mhm.
like I like
That is a good line.
that's a great spirit, but I that's a great sentiment. I mean to say, But I also just like the idea. Maybe this isn't my world anymore. There's limitations to
Yeah,
what I know. You kind of
Mm,
have to figure this out on your own. I don't know Thrawn, not really. You know what I mean? It's like
right.
the C'baoth character. I never met him, or if he did,
Yeah.
it was in a different context or kind of a thing. You know, there's a number of ways you could have
Which is
the same
true,
thing.
technically, looking back on
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
You
yeah,
Um,
did meet C'baoth, or at least the Joruus C'baoth, his
sort
original.
of. Yeah.
that's all
Yeah,
over Star Wars though, with the fact that R2 and C-3PO know everything they do, etc. It's always been fun.
yeah. Well, actually, yeah. Well, C'baoth would have been a good way to justify it, though. Like, you could have had, if you wanted to integrate C'baoth more into the main story of this book, having him be connected to Luke's inability to connect with Obi-Wan
Yeah, yeah.
actually kind of
There's
would have been a better way of
like Matt
handling
said,
him.
there's a lot of in-world ways you could have got around it and different solutions to it. And I agree. The ones Matt mentioned and that you as well could have been good choices. For me, I mean, just the idea that he couldn't remanifest until the Jedi had been rebuilt a little bit, so that the Force was more, had been tuned to better. It wasn't strong enough to be connected for the fact that Luke's the only one. Anything, there's loads of ways that you could have it that he can't appear right now but can appear later on. The most important part, though, is I agree with the decision to have it be that Luke was alone for this moment. I think that the premise, the reason he was trying to get rid of it, I agree with you, Evan, that the actual scene feels a little bit forced. Like you can feel the writer's hand is like, got to get him out of the way, otherwise it's going to be a problem for me or awkward for me later on.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. I think there's a way to, even within this context, to make that feel less that case, a bit more subtle, a bit more refined. I also agree within that context that the choice of it being I'm moving on, I trust you to take care of this. My trust in you should be enough to guide you to make the right decisions, and therefore I'm stepping on away for a bit. I agree with all of that. But the idea that the Force Ghosts had to not be around at any given moment, because just the in-world, clinical, boring aspect of it, that he could literally sit down and go, and this is the Jedi Code, Luke, written out in full. Like, if I'm just going to dictate it you, and you can sculpt it down, you can learn everything you need to know about the Jedi through me, and this 900-year-old Jedi that just materialized next to me. And lesson 4 is this. All of the kind of dry, silly stuff like that it doesn't need to really, because again, hand waves are fine, but it kind of needed an explanation for why that wasn't the case. Luke is forging a new Jedi Order, and that is best executed in my mind if it's Luke doing it and him struggling through it and him philosophizing and studying old texts and reaching out for what he feels the new Jedi should be as opposed to the old, all that kind of stuff. That works better in a place of isolation and self-discovery and with new characters coming to the fore. Yeah.
On in the tone of what you're talking about, this is where it bites me in the butt, where I don't really watch the prequels that often. I know that in some version of the story, whether it's the movie of Revenge of the Sith or the novel that we all love, I know that Yoda makes mention of the fact that the Order has stagnated because he hasn't allowed it, partially at least, because he hasn't allowed it to move forward. Does he say that in the film, Evan? Do you
That,
remember,
that,
or
that's
is it only a book thing?
I don't believe
It's
so.
from the
It's
book.
a book
Okay.
film. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, that same idea, I think, could also be at play where there's limitations to what we have to offer in some sense, and part of the reason why you were raised on Tatooine, I mean, Obi-Wan could have taken him anywhere, but Yoda decided to take him to his family, loosely his family. It's sort of like his sort of step uncle's plot of land, kind of.
well, I mean,
Sure,
who else would he really have in the grand scheme of things?
Sure, it would have been entirely fine if they had had more of a relationship with Anakin, as far as I was concerned. To
Yeah,
me, that he's somebody who showed up once, said, "Where's my mom?" and then a couple of days later brought a corpse home and then left.
yeah,
Just I don't
yeah.
know, but I mean, I always felt that Owen and Beru
Another
should have been in the
another
prequels
reason
more than they were. But
Yeah.
Another reason that scene from the Attack of the Clones novel between Shmi and Owen really should have been in the movie, but that's a
well,
discussion for another day.
we'll look at that book someday because I
Yeah.
haven't read that in a million years, and you mention it every now and then, and I feel like it's time to dust that one off. But anyway, yeah. So the early book I think does a fantastic job of catching, for the most part. There's like these little hiccups that we're talking about, but it catches us up on the new situation, the new status quo, how characters
Hmm.
are introduced to it. I actually spoke to this when we looked at the films recently, that I always thought it was funny that, to me, kind of out of nowhere, Han is General Solo, where he was very much like a smuggler, like, alley cat kind of guy, and now he's General Solo. I really like the way that he comes off in that role in this book. I mean, like with like his prior experience and like his new outlook on life, and he's dealing with all these people who haven't yet non-respectable or whatever. I love his conversation over the with Akbar.
Yes.
That just all that stuff,
Yeah,
it's really, really
well,
well handled stuff.
It's
and
material that could very easily be taken as boring as well. He very
Yeah.
very carefully breathes life and real kind of human spirit into these discussions.
Mhm.
He's basically just doing some trade negotiations, and
Yeah.
logistical stuff, and he makes
It's
it.
that
It's
stuff
not about
Lucino
that.
does.
Yeah,
He's the
exactly,
OG
exactly.
Lucino.
Yeah,
Yes.
Exactly.
It's
He's making
all the
no
different
no no.
levels.
It's about the people. It's about what they want from it. It's
Yeah.
about what that represents in how they are perceiving and receiving help from the New Republic. It's the concerns everyone has for, is this New Republic going to be decent? Because the Old Republic wasn't perfect. All of this is helping to establish the strain and stress and difficulties of the new government coming in, which isn't just for the sake of world building, though that is obviously very important. It's also for the sake of showing Leia's strain and Han's struggles and Mon Mothma's and everything, and it all builds to set the stage for the kind of what the world and the characters are reaching for amidst the turbulence of Thrawn coming into the fold. So he very carefully kind of portions these pieces out, gives each of the characters things to do that connect to the larger whole.
This is also
very effective.
Yeah. No, yeah, we get introduced to the New Republic, council with Mon Mothma, Akbar, and Borsk Phalia, who, of course, becomes a major player, later on, eventually becoming, for all intents and purposes, the new chancellor of the New Republic during the Vong War, and anyone who reads those books knows how that turned out. But
By the way, before we're asked, it is going to take a while because there's 19 of those books. But yes, we are going to look at NJO. Okay, so
and we're very excited
just
to as well.
Give us some time. Give us some time. Some of us have not read them all. Yeah. Okay. So
also myself, I've only read a portion of those. I'm very excited to finally finish the series. So.
You guys.
I know it's going to be a good run. But they are, like Matt said, it's 19 of them, and we've got other things to get to first. So bear with us.
It's a bit of a mission, but this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the Razor's Edge, state of the galaxy. We also, also worth mentioning that we're introduced at this time. Leia is pregnant with twins who are force sensitive, so that's a big deal. So in case it wasn't stressful enough for this family, they're going through quite a bit right now. Obviously, eventually grow into Jason and Jaina Solo, who become very significant in Luke's new Jedi Order. So again, just more sprinkling of continuity there. Another major plot point. I also like the fact, like, when it comes to the sort of structure of the New Republic Council, I do like how they very specifically establish each of these representatives is not only coming into it with very different life experiences, but each of their perspectives very much inform different aspects of this government. Like, you have Mon Mothma, who's like, and Leia, who are like the more diplomatic side of things. You have Borsk Phalia, who's essentially like he's portrayed as being very, very indignant, but at the same time he's representing that like new blood of the people. And what you mentioned before, Callan, about the hesitancy with the failings of the old Republic, Borsk Phalia himself is very much a representation of that, in the sense of like, no, we are not going to repeat what happened before. We have to do this. And then juxtaposed to him, and I really like how they have Akbar, who's very much set up to be, him and Phalia are very much foils to each other, because he's coming into it with his perspective of him serving the old Republic and Alliance military in the past. So it's a very interesting clash of personalities, because even though Phalia is very much built up to be the villain in this scenario, I do like, at the very least, I don't like Phalia, and he's very much written to be an unlikable character, but at the same time, you get enough sense of him where you can at least see where he's coming from his perspective, which is very nice, because again, it kind of like with Thrawn and Pellaeon and C'baoth, this could have easily been cliched. So again, just little things like that are very strong.
I think
the writing.
I think it does. I think that the post Return of the Jedi era does that better than most others. There are a number of characters that fit that description. Some of them more unlikable than others. Some more even keeled. It does that quite a lot, and it's usually steeped in the topic of governance, which is where it belongs, because that's not an easy thing to do. Um,
I
just look outside and see that today.
especially at this scale. I like
Yeah.
too. Well, first of all, on the failure aspect, Evan, I think the reason he works is, to me, he could have worked better if we'd had more time to spend with him. But it's a limited scale story. You know, they can't build everyone up the way they can in other stories. The thing that makes him work as well as it does, though, is that similar to Thrawn, we see people's perspective on him from different areas. And people respect him, people respond to him. The indignance later on when people say, "What kind of person do you think he is? He's not going to do a coup," you know, that kind of thing. We get to see the layman's view. People who perhaps traditionally would otherwise back Akbar, you know, are behind him. So you kind of get the idea of what he's supposed to represent through everyone else's perspective, even though we don't spend time with him much as a character. But I also, on top of that, for the government as a whole, I like that it's a provisional council. I like the fact that even 5 years later, he's acknowledging the realistic truth of the fact that a government like this would not be springing back into the new Old Republic scale, you know, just out of nowhere. This is something that's going to take a decade-ish at least to get the established and the groundwork finished off for it. And I love that they're struggling with it. You know, what are we supposed to be? You know, what should we be as to how can we get there? You know, if that is if we all agree that's what we should be, we disagree on how we're going to get there. You know, the struggles and challenges of governments from every level is kind of, without bogging the story down, touched on, you know, piecemeal throughout the first book, and then followed up with the rest of the trilogy.
Yeah. Which makes it all the more tragic when you think to yourself, like, oh, you know, they spent, you know, this council, they spend all these years, they build up the new republic, it's fully established, they have all these things, and then the Yuuzhan Vong are like, allow us to introduce ourselves, and
a new player
we
has
all
entered
see
the
where
ring.
that goes. Yeah.
It's very well handled. You know, he clearly cares about the world and wants to make it feel real and lived in, and that's something I think he very much achieves. But I want to move us on.
Sorry, just a very small thing before you move on. A representation of Bothan culture and a representation of Bothan governance is really not something they'd had at this point.
Physiology as well was very cool.
That's what I'm saying. A little bit of like that sort of world building and the eventual setup with, you know, some of the storylines with the Bothan planet later on. Again, like little sprinkling of things. I really like that. So I just wanted to move on.
Yeah, he's very good at that all throughout. Species, and, you know, and cultural interpretation of things, etc. He layers in very well. He is, as Matt said, he's the Lucino of his day. He's the proto Lucino of the Star Wars universe.
I think the next major point we should probably move into is, I guess the introduction of Wayland with, you know, C'baoth and all that.
Yeah, well, to be perfectly honest, most of that the only real crux of that matters is the fact that we're going into the Thrawn's plan. You know, it is the assets that he's bringing into the fold. It's basically introducing, at this point, it's a mystery box, but you know, later on will be expanded on the assets he's bringing to the war effort. Because we are as disinterested in C'baoth as we are, I don't have too much to say about it other than the fact that it serves its function. You know, it gets him into the plot.
Yeah.
I'll note the first time reading through this, I've noted a flaw in the writing. Is Thrawn says the word "thing" when he could have said "structure," which to me didn't make no sense. He read like I think it's that palace thing up ahead, and I was like, that doesn't sound like Thrawn.
It's a
but that's one of those tiny
casual,
little blips I mentioned before.
For me, it's like this introduction, this whole sequence. Well, first of all, it leads us into another like writing point, which is very clearly written in to like explain something strange from the movies, where they establish the fact that one of the reasons the Imperial, you know, Navy really collapsed, after the death of the Emperor was because quite literally his will, his, you know, what you want to call it, battle meditation, his will, his just connection to the dark side was driving all of that. And when he died, essentially it's like cutting off the signal from like a commander, essentially, and they left in disarray. And again, clearly this was meant to sort of explain how the alliance was able to sort of break a much larger force of, you know, naval force so quickly after that happened. You know, like the Superstar Destroyer is like the biggest point. You know, how does one ship manage to get through all that in order to finally hit obviously that was written in to explain.
It was a lot of damage control, a very well handled damage control by a
Timothy
well
Zahn
built
has even
focused
said,
writer.
like, I wrote this in as a way of explaining that, like, you know, and I'm not even saying that, like, you know, like Sidious controlling the Armada like a puppet master is very much in character for him. If anything, it adds kind of more menace to that sequence in particular when because like you think of it like when he's like saying, "Oh, your fleet is being destroyed," to Luke when he's looking out into the void, seeing all the ships blow up. You think like, "Oh, he's doing that intentionally,
I
and
mean, it
he's
creates
quite
battle
literally."
meditation as a concept. If nothing else, that comes through to
Exactly.
the
So
rest of the
that's
setting.
I do very much like that, but again, kind of like the Obi-Wan thing, you could really feel Timothy Zahn's hand
Yeah,
or
damage
pen, whatever you
control.
want to call it, writing into that. So that is something worth bringing up. It also introduces though the effects of the Ysamari, creating
Mm,
bubbles in the Force, and the fact that, and again, very obvious plot device because you think to yourself, why not? Why doesn't C'baoth just overthrow them and take control of the fleet himself? Like that's a way of
yeah.
rationalizing that, and that gets me too because it's like I don't care for C'baoth much as a character, much like you guys do. What I do like about him, though, is he's such a wild card, such a loose cannon due to his insanity. It's a good way of representing how complete, unbounded, I guess, force potential you ever want to call it. Because with the Emperor, like obviously with the Emperor and Vader, they're ruthless, but they're also clinical.
Mm,
C'baoth's just completely unhinged, and the
off his
fact
rocker.
that exactly, like, and that really, it's a good way of establishing like the menace in that because for as dangerous as Vader and the Emperor are, you at least can somewhat imagine what they would do next. With C'baoth, you never know if he's just gonna turn around and fry your ass in a second for like speaking to him the wrong way. And that adds its own unique layer of menace, which is I think very interesting. And again, it helps them form a very unique little trifecta with Thrawn and Pellaeon, you know?
I think that
Yeah.
would work better if uh Sabayev had like a goal that I would like appreciate watching him work
Right.
towards. I just don't to me that aspect I agree with you. It, it objectively I think it works in
Mm,
exactly the way you're saying it does. Subjectively, I think that makes me find him even more annoying. And it's hard for me to justify that, but I don't like him, I guess, and so just him being as nuts as he is, it's almost like he's even more kind of I don't know. It's just difficult
Well,
for me to
well,
tolerate than
I'm in the same space
it
because
all
even things like his actual motivation, the way that Thrawn manipulates him and talks about his, idea of power, etc. The fact that C'baoth is like, oh yes, I can be the one who brings in the Jedi. I can have Jedi, tools to mold to my face. All of it works objectively. Like on paper, he's ticked all the boxes he needs to make it a functional part of the story. But again, I just don't care about it. He doesn't bring anything that personally excites me as a character,
Mhm.
and therefore everything else kind of falls flat. But
I
yeah,
think
it's
it's
very hard to
we
explain
spoke
why that is the case.
when we
It
spoke
also
about
doesn't help
well
that he doesn't have quite as much presence in this book as he will in the rest of
Yeah.
the trilogy. Even though he has a lot of screen time, he has a lot more in the next two books that really help flesh out what little character he has. So I'm
Mm.
not saying
I
that's like
think
a justification for the writing with him in this, of course, or anything. But it is a factor to bring up.
Yeah.
I just think it's because when we talked about Return of the Jedi recently, it's like the Emperor is such a great presence, and I don't think he's that deep of a character. In fact, quite the opposite. Like the more I learned about him and his past, the more shallow and kind of disinterested I am in Palpatine. Like as a boy, as a senator, as a chancellor, as a manipulator, he's just kind of an asshole. As a force, though, as like a force of nature, as like an embodiment of evil, and specifically of like temptation.
Mm.
Those scenes are perfect. They're immaculate, and um, I don't. I just don't get that from Mr. Sabayoff. I just don't. Like everything he's about is in my mind kind of lesser, like by
Mm.
comparison.
Right.
I think it is heightened by the fact that it's precisely with the same cast of characters. You know what I mean? If he was dealing with some Jedi like 1,000 years ago, like in the Bane era, for example, for that character, maybe it's a new story for them. But
Mm.
for Luke, it's like it's a second and lesser go around, and not the last one that we're gonna get. Like
Thanks
far
to
from
Dark
it, and
Empire,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Right.
And
But
then and then I mean, his own nephew. We complain about the sequel trilogy, but I
Oh,
mean, Jason goes to the dark side and
fuck you,
and
Jason.
is EU anyway.
We'll get
So
to
it's
that
like
with MJO
it's like,
start.
it's just
Tell us how you
things like
really feel,
that.
Callan.
What, sorry?
I said, tell us how you really feel,
Oh,
Callan.
I hate Jason with a burning passion.
But
Jaina
so
for
it's
president.
just I just bring all this up because like I just his character is very much I don't want to I'm trying to be very careful and not call it because I'm honest when I say I don't think he's flawed writing. I don't
Mm.
think he's a badly produced character. I just cannot care about him. You know what I mean? It's like I physically, emotionally, mentally just it's a blip. Alan said zero earlier. It's absolute zero.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's rare for me as well when that happens that I don't have at least some kernel of a why behind it. I think you've touched on
Mhm.
the closest thing that we're going to find for it, though, is the fact that it does feel very much like a rehash, but lesser with the Emperor's presence. You
Mhm.
know, he doesn't have that, and the fact that I guess I'm just more interested in everything else that's going on with the Thrawn trilogy. Everything else
Everything
is
else,
so
yeah.
It
cool by
works.
comparison, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
but
like we keep saying, he works better as a in an ensemble as more of a plot device than actually a
mm.
plot point. But
And also, I think he
to that
feels that
though,
way. He feels very plot
yeah,
devicey, I suppose. Like you can see, oh, he's supposed to be here for the Jedi party. He's supposed to be here to give some
right,
Thrawns an edge. He's supposed to, you know, it doesn't feel like he's got. He would not function as the trilogy's like titular villain. You know, he would if you took Thrawn out, this trilogy fails, like dead on arrival, pretty much. I think that is probably true for most people reading. But in the comments,
You
let us
know,
know if you do like him. Like if anyone has a
yeah,
particularly strong feeling in counter to this for C'baoth, let us know what you
yeah.
feel because I'd be interested to see it.
And like once we get into the rest of the trilogy where he has more presence, we might have more to say about him. But
Mm.
as is in this book, he is very, very bare bones. And you could maybe argue that that was like intentional, like especially since like again that tool aspect that Thrawn very specifically views him as. But like that's the thing though, just because you're being ironically bland doesn't really mean that you're still not bland, you know?
Yeah, and it kind of sets him up as a background presence that's going to be a problem for Thrawn later on, kind of teeing one of his oversights a bit up. I get that, but
Right.
yeah, just it doesn't resonate for me emotionally. And what were you going to say, Matt?
I was gonna say that so I mentioned that I'm not as in love with Thrawn himself as many people are. But when Thrawn's doing his Thrawn thing, like front and center, I'm not actively thinking, I really don't want to be here. With
Mm.
C'baoth, I am. I find that's the difference. It's like I would much rather be reading a different part of this very book, not just another story entirely, but get me back
Mhm.
to Leia on
Yeah,
Kashyyyk, get me back
Yeah.
to Han and Lando, get me back to Talon Karrde. Whenever he's on screen or on page, rather, I'm just like I just don't care, and that's the
Yeah.
difference between like
Right.
that's why I keep singling him out as like the weakest link for me.
Of
You
I'd
know.
like to move on
Let's,
to a
yeah.
bit of a kind of like a. It's like the middle section between the two first thirds of this now because my biggest critique of this book is in the not quite, but essentially repetition of the different Noghri attacks. Once you've had one, you've had them all, kind of thing in terms of how they're being played out. But which sounds far too derogatory or reductive, put that way. But to me, all of the interesting stuff happens in the transitions between the attacks, in the aftermath, in the build up. The actual kind of plot concept of these happening 3 times over, to me, I didn't find interesting. I felt like they could have been the page space they took up could have been better handled for me. It's the single like weakness of the book overall that I think I was probably remembering a bit more and expecting more to be, you know, throughout the entire story when I came back to this, expecting these books to not hold up
Yeah.
quite as much as they did for me.
I think that's just maybe a pacing thing, but
That's what
also
I mean in
if
that
I'm
that
yeah,
line.
but what I'm but I think and I think he might even the author might even engage with I don't want to speak for him, but if I remember rightly, the Noghri were he was kind of making them out to be what he thought was going to be the original Sith, like Vader was the Dark Lord of those. And like they had like worshipped him, and I think his armor
Yeah.
was even supposed to be
His
based
mask
on
was
them.
like yeah, his mask was like originally thought of as like having been designed,
By the Noghri face shape,
Oh,
yeah,
and
okay.
so like and because I think I'm being confusing with how I said this. This book came out at a time where somehow, some way, you had been told Darth Vader was the Lord of the Sith, but you didn't know what a Sith was, and George
Hmm.
hadn't told anybody. So that's also why you get specifically the terms like Dark Jedi showing up in works like this. I don't know if this is
mhm,
the first time you saw it, but it's that's what he tends to fall back on. And he now, I think the author has said something like he's grateful for not having gone and defined the Sith completely the wrong way because it has nothing to do with what they ended up being. But I think that if you were, it's a funny thing. He could defend his choices in the time and still be glad that things went a different way. But the
Yeah.
reason why you're getting such build up to them is because that scene that ultimately culminates with Leia meeting one whose name is escaping me, and he explains all this. It was all because he had a grander idea for what the Noghri were
Mm.
supposed to end up being, I
And
think.
the
You know?
notion of a
I think
Noghri as a
it doesn't
concept and a
really.
culture and a species, everything about them in terms of being what they are, attacking them and chasing them, I like that. And the scene work that's done in and around the actual attacks themselves, I love. There's pockets of it that are fantastic, but just the plot concept of having, they go somewhere to do something, they get attacked. They run away, they go somewhere to do something, they get attacked. They run away, they go to do something, to get attacked. The repeats of it 3 times, even though handled very well in isolation, I think you could have achieved what you did for each without having that repetitive aspect. Because Leia's, while perfectly handled as a character, her story in this book is the least interesting for me as a result of that. What Han and Lando are doing, separated and the transitional stuff in between is really interesting, even though it's kind of working around that problem. That changes and develops all the way through. The tail end of Leia's situation on Kashyyyk, when it's a bit more nuanced than just they get attacked, there's more texture to it. Really find that interesting. But even things like with the second attack, with the fact that Wedge is present, there's cool stuff here all throughout. But it's just, I feel like you could have handled all of that and not had it be 3 separate attacks they have to run away from and escape.
I think it really doesn't help too, in the sense that, because like the prose and like the writing, it very much, the Noghri are constantly built up as these like super elite, super effective like warriors, who like even like the highest of the Empire like are generally afraid of, and yet
keep failing.
and yet they pretty much fail at every turn. So by the time the final, not that the assassinations aren't like attempts aren't like well depicted in and of itself, the fact that like there's such a juxtaposition between what's said about them and what actually happens on page, it comes off as kind of, the impact doesn't really hit as much. So like by the time you're getting to that final attempt, and even though the scene where Leia finally meets the one and uncovers their connection to her family is interesting, but by then it would have landed a lot harder if this had been like, we didn't need 3. It could have been 2. It could have been 1.
Or even just
that
some level of escalation to it. That's the idea. I mean, there was. Again, he did enough to make it work. I just think it's the weaker part of the book. It's not like a massive flaw by any means. Just compared to the rest of the pacing of the plot, it stands out to me. But even things like, I don't want him to have done this, but as an example, Lando and Wedge get massively injured in a second attack or something, and that adds stakes to the fact that these are main characters that have been injured and incapacitated despite their usual competence, all that kind of stuff. They could have done something to elevate the stakes of, okay, these are a problem faction we need to deal with. Like, we can't just rest on our laurels here anymore, like we have been. We have to get out, or we are going to die. Something to just really shape it as a not necessarily a tragedy, but as a high stakes threat.
You know how I said what his original notion was, that he was kind of building what the Noghri were supposed to be in his head. I think that's one of his notions that he was like really attached to. And when they kept kind of pushing back on, okay, but don't call them Sith or don't do this. We have a feeling that Lucas wants to do something with that. And I think there was probably at one point, like in an earlier draft, I wouldn't be surprised if there were masses even more than what we got. I think there was probably a lot more Noghri than what we even ended up with. And so I think he probably was told to trim out bits of it, and he just kept as much of it as he thought he could. I'm not saying that justifies it. I'm saying that now, with like 30 something years of hindsight, if you were to ask him today, he might well agree with what you're saying. Is it because he was
I wouldn't be
working off?
surprised either, especially considering what we see with the follow-up books.
Yeah.
But like, that kind of leads us into other sequences. Before we get to like Leia and Kashyyyk, I think it's worth noting the sequence where Luke goes back to Dagobah to see if he can find any sort of relics left behind by
This
Yoda
is always
his Jedi training. Sorry, go ahead.
He's there looking for the sacred Jedi texts that we didn't know about.
Jedi texts. Yeah, exactly.
But no.
Delivery of that line. Oh.
Jedi text. Yeah. I mean, we have never been a thing. Also, but Anyway,
Ah.
Ryan Johnson. But uh, this whole sequence, this always felt a little. I like all this and the way that the unfurling of everything, and he discusses what he finds like later with his sister, and I like how it's like Lando, like everybody has a bit of insight to help progress the
Hmm.
unfurling of it. But I've never like looking at it in the clear light of day. How much does all this matter? You know what I mean? Like, it's
It
trying to.
it's a
I
bit
guess
of
it's
filler
also
for
to
Luke to be
answer
doing
questions.
something. It feels like,
Yeah,
for the most
but
part.
also it's answering questions I never wanted answered. Like it's trying to make sense of why Yoda was where he was or what's mystical about
Hmm.
all that. I have never understood all the. It's a common complaint that goes back to when the film first came out. People have always complained about the Dagobah tree. As like I don't get it, or I don't get what was that. Like, how do you not get it? Like it's to me it's so beautiful and so and such well done filmmaking and so clear that I don't under.
Right.
If Luke approaches Vader this way, he becomes like that, i.e., spiritual failure. I mean, like, what do you mean you don't get it? You know, but so I need to understand why the tree is mystical, and it's because Yoda defeated somebody here and then stayed. It seems to be like his idea was that after the Clone Wars were whatever they were. Yoda was kind of tromping around, like trotting around the galaxy, and settled here eventually. Which, I can't blame him for having that thought because until Revenge of the Sith comes out, you don't know that Yoda went straight to Dagobah, which in itself is a little bit almost kind of silly, without
Just a bit.
further information. You know,
Given
Yeah,
all
which
he
but
could accomplish, should he choose to, the fact that he just gives up the ghost and goes, "Well, I guess I'll wait
yeah.
for Luke to grow
goes
up,"
straight to
is a
Dagobah.
Well,
bit
I mean,
strange.
Also,
because then we wouldn't have the Clone Wars with Qui-Gon's ghost leading him to Dagobah.
God.
Ay. Oh boy.
someday, can we talk about that just as
Just
its
to get it
own
off our
thing?
chests, yeah, and
Pretty much,
get out on the
yeah. That
on.
whole little arc was so
If
bad.
and I want to say, I at least will not be kind when that day comes. But if you like that for some reason, that's okay. But I just want to explain how our interpretations of like just the storytelling craft differ. So if you're
Mm.
open to having that
We'll probably
conversation,
cover that at
you know,
some point then.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But like I do like little there are a few little things about this sequence I do kind of appreciate. Like I like
I
how the
like them
fact
all.
that
I
yeah,
like. Sorry, I don't. I won't interrupt you again, but I just want to say I like all of it. I'm just not sure
mm,
what it all is supposed to like tie in together, like what you're supposed to think of it after you've read the whole damn thing. But individually, I like every scene. I just wanted to make
mm,
that clear. I'm not
likewise.
complaining about the
yeah,
the
no,
scene
no,
work. But anyway,
yeah, no,
yeah.
yeah, no problem, no problem. I was just saying like little story aspects that they touch on with this. Like I like how they established the fact that like Luke didn't think that in this environment Yoda's hut would have degraded so quickly because it
Yeah, nice
establishes that like
touch.
on Tatooine
Very
like on a
nice
desert
touch.
planet everything is like preserved for like decades and decades and decades and like he just didn't think like oh yeah on like a swamp world like this obviously the vegetation would have overgrown and essentially eaten
That's
the hut down to its
that's a
like
pocket
that's
of
very
culture
interesting.
just written
Yeah.
large in microculture. It's so concisely got across. I love that you brought that up because that is
Yeah.
that's how what he does all throughout. It's like just a tiny little brushstroke that added a whole new branch of delight to that otherwise innocuous scene.
Mhm.
I love it. Yeah, brilliant.
And then yeah, and then like we get the cave sequence, which I think the point of that to your point, Matt, is like it's basically just so Luke can have foreshadowing for Mara Jade
Mm.
and
Which
who
is all
Mara
valid, by the
Jade's
way. That's
backstory.
great. Like it's just it's how it's everything. The apparatus around it, I just think,
Mm.
toes the line of like
Well,
deflating some of the larger, grander mystery of the setting as a whole.
yeah.
Mm.
And
Yeah. I was about to say though too, like this doesn't happen in this sequence, but it's connected to it. I like how it's established that Luke actually didn't even tell anybody,
Mhm.
including Leia, about Yoda and
Mm.
about his location because he feared that it could have potentially put him in danger even after all this time. Like when Leia even has a line like, "Oh, are you finally gonna tell me about your secret training spot?" Like I love that. That's how she says it. But
And you
I
can
but I
also
love
hear it in her voice as well. Again, a little piece of
yeah.
dialogue that comes out perfectly.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It makes sense in hindsight, but the fact that like again, just little world building, story elements that like Zahn puts in, it's like yeah, it would make sense for him to want to keep this on the down low, but at the same time, it's like oh yeah, like so he didn't even tell Leia about this. Like this is interesting. So, um, little points like that. Like yeah, the sequence in itself, like it's all set up. This whole sequence, just so Luke can kind of have these revelations. But also, it's interesting too because like Yoda's conflict with the Dark Jedi in the Dagobah cave is something that even other works like that's been retconned so many times in so many different ways. Like, oh no, it happened at this time. Oh, it was this Dark Jedi. No, actually, it was this Dark Jedi, and this actually happened at this time. It's like, no, the cave was always evil. It's like, no, it actually wasn't until this. It's like, pick a lane.
And it,
Oh,
and it
Starkiller
never
went there.
mattered. Like it never
Yeah,
ever mattered is the thing, you know? It's just
Yeah.
it never
that's
needed
exactly
an
it. Like,
explanation, you know?
Yeah,
yeah,
people are
but
using it as like a set piece more than
it
anything else.
should have
I
been.
think the biggest
Mm.
crime about this, and it's not a major problem because he had to have something to do, but this was basically only here because Luke needed something to do for this part of the story. He didn't have a
Mhm.
mission in the way the other characters did quite the same way. He could have got the Mara and Jade set up from like he had an unsettling dream while in hibernation in the X-wing at one point, jolted awake as Mara's appearing with through the Talon Karrde situation. Anything could have set up that level, which didn't even need setup anyway, because all it ultimately is was it wasn't even like a sign of the future. It's a possible past vision that he got, kind of explaining the nebulous nature of the Force, visions, which is fine and great and well handled. But she didn't need any setup. She worked for even from Luke's perspective, coming at him cold, which is basically what happened anyway until he pieces it together later on. This is essentially just something for him to do while everyone else is doing what they're doing, and I think, like you said, Matt, it's handled perfectly within the scene work. Every scene of this book, even with C'baoth, even if you don't care about C'baoth himself, is really well handled. Like he has boots on the ground perspective mastery of story, hands down to me. And to be honest, more world building credit than even I was giving him, because obviously you remember the high points of what he brought to the world, but he really is Lucino-like in terms of how he's delivering beat for beat all of these different aspects of the world and the texture and stuff. It's more consistent and constantly there than you remember because of he's doing it a bit more subtly and a bit more
I think he does it.
fine-tuned
I was
than
gonna
the
say,
larger scale stuff that Lucino does.
yeah, see, Lucino will I think he finds better character voices to do this with than others at times. He's not
Mm.
always equally successful, but he will sometimes just stop telling the story to tell you about where you now are.
Mm.
Um, and that is there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it does kind of almost take on the flavor of reading like an RPG guide entry about the planet this or
Yeah.
whatever. You're literally stopping the plot to tell what's going on. I don't recall a single time where Zahn does that. And also, by the way, Lucino, like I said, sometimes he finds better characters where it flows perfectly well.
Mm.
Plagueis is a good example. It makes sense for Plagueis to know and talk about and think about almost like 99% of what he does through his POV all makes sense. And the same when he's handling Palpatine. On Coruscant, for example, I always think of that as being particularly vivid. Adjusting to life on Coruscant as a new politician to the game
Mm.
is you don't really see that many scenes of it, but the way he talks about going through life is very well handled. Uh, Zahn does that effortlessly with comparatively fewer word count. You know what I mean? He just dips in and out and gives you these little.
It's almost like the opposite
He's
of a hand wave, right? But it's
yeah.
delivering information rather than brushing it off. It's the delivery
Yeah.
version of that for me. He just kind of
It,
throws
it's
out a
well,
line,
you
and
mentioned
maybe he'll build on it later, like with the hand thing you mentioned before. Like, you didn't just say, "Oh, I'm going to use the hand for the power cell." Later, it became
yeah
that type of power
yeah
cell was delivered by this company, and we know that because we
yeah
were involved when it was. That's how he does it. He does it kind of like a spread out piecemeal that adds together to form a collective. Whereas Zeno will be usually very artfully dumping it on you in one go.
mhm.
That's the kind of
I
difference, I
will.
think.
Though it is kind of peculiar when you think about it in hindsight. The fact that Luke is on Coruscant and has been for some time, and yet absolutely no mention of the Jedi Temple is ever made.
Oh, what's that
That wasn't.
structure over there? Oh, don't worry about
Yeah,
it.
it's just weird when you think about it because you imagine that Luke is like on his balcony thinking, "Oh man, I need to learn more about the Jedi.
Well,
I have to this responsibility." And when that's there,
yeah,
like
it's just one of those
again, I
continuity
give him a
quirks.
pass. It's a
Yeah, it
continuity thing.
wasn't
It's
there
just
at the
very,
time. Yeah, exactly. And
it's
also,
very weird.
from his perspective,
I've
it
always
never
been
made any
confused
sense. It
also.
never made any sense for it to ever be there. Why would the Jedi Temple be
Right.
sat right on the Capitol next to the
But
central
well,
thing?
what? See, I'm genuinely because again, I've always dipped in and out of the post Return of the Jedi era. Like, what actually happens to the Jedi Temple? Can I get like a brief rundown? Like, because by Legacy Comics, isn't it turned into like a giant pyramid or something?
Yeah, so it
Um,
was it was the temple itself was destroyed when the Vong invaded. So after
right.
they
Okay.
recaptured Coruscant, they rebuilt it and into this more pyramid like structure, and it
Okay.
essentially just served as the nucleus for the
And so
NJO.
the Imperial Palace has always been
its own
Completely
thing.
separate structure. Okay,
Yes.
all right. Because so Palpatine just left it there in effect
I mean,
after.
I mean, it was in ruins, but yes, yeah,
Okay,
essentially.
all right.
And obviously, Yavin, the temples on Yavin 4 were obviously also the base for a long time as well for the New Jedi Order stuff. Before we ever knew about it, continuity-wise,
The
the Jedi
Praxium,
Emperor.
yeah.
Yeah, which is all very cool.
Yeah, but
And that's why you would get setups for stories like Exar Kun afterward, right?
Yes,
Because he was
yeah,
yeah,
haunting,
yeah.
like yeah.
And it's like,
Um,
but yeah, like the whole, but it's just again, it just comes off as kind of strange in hindsight. There's a few moments like that in this book, but
mm.
but speaking of which, like speaking of very good world building that I really appreciate, Leia on Kashyyyk.
Mm.
I
Now
like all this. Yeah.
I love this sequence in particular, and it's very nostalgic for me because it actually reminds me a lot of when I first played KOTOR.
Hmm.
Because I remember when I've mentioned this way in the past, but my favorite level in the original KOTOR, when I first started playing it, was always Kashyyyk. Because at the time, my familiarity with like the Kashyyyk and the Wookiee culture was very limited. So that was
Hmm.
kind of my first major exposure to that world and all the things. First of all, and also the Kashyyyk levels in that game are just excellent in my opinion. So this reminded me a lot of that same feeling that I got when I first, started playing KOTOR. So seeing the Wookiee culture, seeing, their unique take on technology is again, I really love this sequence from a world building perspective, mainly because of nostalgia. But at the same time too, I like how they establish little things like although the Wookiees have a lot of reverence for nature, they're still not opposed to relying on certain forms of advanced technology that Leia even points out. Like even but at that same time, what they do use is in some ways more complex than what the New Republic has, and that little juxtaposition is very interesting.
Yeah, they supplement
Yeah.
their culture with the technology they've inherited. They don't rely on it in the same way, which is very cool. It fits with the vibe of the species for sure.
Yeah,
When they made
we get the
KOTOR, they
Wookiee.
were clearly pulling all from this, like
Mm.
even down to some of the way they named the other character, like the other
Yeah,
random Wookiee characters you would like bump into. I was almost like, wait a minute, isn't that the name of that one Wookiee that you find like dead in that one mission? But yeah, I mean, it's almost like I feel very much that the whole thing was a giant, paying homage to
mm.
Zahn's, critique, with that,
Yeah.
very
Well,
much so.
even like the things with like Wookiees detest using their
Claws,
claws for anything
Mm.
hmm
but like maintenance and stuff.
a
Like
mad
obviously that's
claw, yeah. Yeah,
a major point.
that's what Zalbar is, because he had attacked.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I love all of it. There's not much I can say other than that. Is that because it's every little bit of it is just fun
We
Yeah,
get
flavor and
the
world
they're
building,
all
we
the
and
get
same. They're all great for the same reasons, kind of thing. The lived-in feel of it and the characters being realized the way they are. One thing I will say about this particular sequence, Leia's it sounds really weirdly niche, but Leia's sensory experience here, when the visual of when she's being carried by Chewbacca underneath the branch, the way he portrays that and makes it very visceral, like the idea that they would travel under on all fours beneath the branch, and then they traveled. Like just saying that to get across the concept of the speed, the fact that she had closed her eyes and she was just everything about kind of making that feel like you're experiencing as a reader was very well handled, and that written large for the culture as a whole, I think he did a very good job of
you,
delivering. He really
you
puts
can
you in the
imagine
in
you
the
can
boots of the
imagine
character.
yeah, you can imagine the speed and the weight, and you can just like imagine like the feeling of traveling with even though her eyes are shut. It's an excellent perspective shot.
The expression of her fear as well when it passes, when she feels like she's got some semblance of control, that touching on
Yeah.
that instinctive aspect of well, first of all the human experience, but also her Jedi experience kind of enhancing, like it doesn't kick in until she has a bit more control and calm, showing the human version, the instinctive version of there is no emotion, there is peace, without her actively drawing on the mantra. I thought that was very effective.
Right. Yeah, we obviously also get the Wookiee who can speak English, who has a speech impediment. It's
because he
interesting how
can't
the
speak Shiri or whatever the Wookiee language is called. I think it's called Shiri or
Sherwook,
something. Or
Sherwook,
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
It was really
yeah.
funny that
Well,
it
But
could have been very easily handled, but she when she says, "Are you about to tell me that you've had a speech impediment this entire time?" to Chewie, the fact that he didn't take that option and he didn't just write off that all Wookiees can talk except Chewie, that would have been so terrible. And he instead
oh
flipped it
God.
on its ass and made it the thing that
I've
made
still
him so
I've
good
still
was
seen the
brilliant.
I've still seen the odd complaint saying that people just can't buy this character. Like either way, they don't want a basic speaking Wookiee, period. But I've never
Hmm.
minded
I,
it.
I can
It's
understand
fun,
that. I don't agree, but I
Yeah,
can understand that. Yeah, and,
yeah.
and it's the fact
But
that it's not
it's
fully
also
speaking based as well. He is also kind of still kind of growling and rolling it out. It's cool.
Yeah,
to talk
it
about the way Timothy Zahn thinks about things. I think he made a comment that he thinks the name Kashyyyk is hard for Wookiees to say, so the planet shouldn't be called that. So again, that's that Lucino brain of like thinking about things. And even if he's thinking about it too much, he doesn't like stick it into the work and distract you with like a pointless musing. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like
exactly. And he touches on that
yeah.
same kind of thinking with the Noghri as well later on when he's saying, well, people call me in your tongue this, but it's actually. And she's like, I'm going to call you this. I can't remember his name. It's Card something. Carbrush or something? It says something like that.
Uh,
I just read it,
like
so I
that.
should know.
But and it also it comes. There's some good comedy in this too, where well, like to your point, when she's asking Chewie about that, and then the other Wookiee's like, "Oh, actually, no, he speaks great. I'm the one with the speech impediment." Like,
But it
it's very
helps me as an
clever.
ambassador, yeah, and so I fit into that role
Well,
well. I like the thinking behind
but
that, and
yeah.
his character is very
But it
fun as well.
also, yeah. But it also gets across the tragedy too of the people because he's saying like, yeah, when we were enslaved by the Empire, I was used
Mm.
as like a go-between for the Imperials. It's like, wow, that's horrible,
He
like
really
to
gracefully
put it.
touches on the experience of the slavery of the Wookiees and making reference to that as part of their lore. Never dives into it, but he always manages to kind of show the emotional resonance for each of the characters present. Even when the Wookiees aren't even in the scene, like when Han and Lando are referencing it later in the book, you can and how it's influenced Han and his decisions, and even the background story that never gets fully revealed until he's talking about it there. He so masterfully kind of takes the whole lore dump and cuts it into tiny little pieces and delivers it where it's most appropriate throughout the story, and you pick it up and gather it as a collective at the end. He's really really good at that, Zahn.
Hmm.
But
Yeah,
where do you want to jump to next? Because that's kind of the first 2/3. I mean, we need to talk about Talon Karrde, I guess, and the
I was gonna
and
say,
the
why don't we talk about it? Because
yeah,
we kind of
because
touched on everything, and
yeah, that's the next. That leads us into the finale. The whole card sequence is all that we haven't talked about the rest of the book.
right.
I love
Yeah,
Talon
the
Karrde.
finale.
I'd forgotten that I really enjoyed him. He's not even that nuanced or deeper character. He's just really nice to be around. The professionalism, like you said before, Matt, he cares about his people. The idea that it's kind of showing a respectable but still not necessarily legal side of the smuggling
It's the honor
trade.
among thieves trope done
Yeah,
like
exactly. Yeah,
exceptionally
Yeah.
well.
perfectly
Like
handled.
yeah,
Yeah, and in the Star Wars,
yeah.
like, it fits the Star Wars vibe. It's not leaning too far into any of the tropes that we know, but also it's paying homage to them. He's a fully realized character in an extremely realized world that's made only better by Zahn's thinking about it,
I
and
I
also is
tend
a
not
good
to
bridge
think
towards
about
Mara as well.
yeah, I tend not to think about him much, like when I'm not reading this
Mm,
book or these books, but he's a really, really well done character. I've only been through the series like maybe twice,
mm.
not
This is
counting
only my
this
second
latest.
time.
So this is
Hmm.
probably like my third time, I guess is what I mean to say. And there's probably maybe the third book I've only read like one and a half times, but the second one, like I said earlier, has always been the one I like the most. But whenever I am reading them, I mean, I can't think of like a Talon Card moment that I don't love. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It's all just little things done well. That's what I have to get across with him. He just fits like he is so perfectly molded to his place in the story, and I wouldn't change a thing about him.
It's kind of the Thrawn Trilogy,
Yeah, I think a lot of
mantra,
it.
isn't
I
it?
think
It's
a lot of
lots
it.
of little
Yeah,
things done really well. Just
Mhm.
I think.
summing up.
Yeah, I think a lot of it really comes down to his dialogue too, and just the way he's portrayed. Because like
Mm,
you instantly get the sense of like what this guy's about, even from his introduction. And I like how he can be he could be just as smooth as he is ruthless, but like you never feel like either side of him is necessarily more true to who he really is.
Mhm.
This is just who he is, and I like to like how you sort of buy how somebody like Mara, someone like Thrawn, and even someone like Han can have a certain degree of respect for this guy without fully really trusting him. Again,
mm.
to your point about the honor among thieves thing, like you feel like this is the kind of person who would capture you, maybe beat you up, but he would never hate you. And if you can get on his good side and you can get his trust, he will have your back even in the most dire situation. So I really appreciate that. It's very, I guess you could almost, uh, like I said, very pirate-like without being cliche.
Yeah,
You
I can't remember exactly how he phrases it, but when he's kind of telling Luke about like what he's putting him through, he's like, well, you got to do some things to like make sure a Jedi stays where you've put him, kind of a thing.
Mm.
It's just really fun little things like that.
And he's also very polite and
And then,
courteous and apologetic about it.
yeah,
It's like, I'm very sorry, I wouldn't
yeah,
otherwise do this, but you can appreciate the dangers involved. Like,
Yeah,
you're a
he doesn't.
Jedi. Like, I managed to sneak up
Yeah,
on you and zap you. Not very easy to do for most people. and
yeah.
also, he
It's
alludes
also,
to the fact that he's actively saying he was shitting himself as he did it. Like, he was so
yeah.
terrified and nervous and worried about things. And, you would have detected
Well,
that if we didn't
this,
have these precautions.
yeah. Well, also the fact like that they're on the planet and there's like Samari everywhere. Just obviously is very intentional to nerf Luke's powers. Otherwise, he would be
Mm.
breezing through these situations
Yeah.
fairly easily. Which I mean, you can say that's cliched or lazy, but
I
it
don't
never
mind
really
it.
gets
I
I
in the
mean,
don't
way.
think so. Yeah, I think it's
It never
appropriate for
gets in
this
the way of the
era.
story.
Yeah, in
Yeah,
terms of
it
when this
never
book
gets in
came
the way of
out,
the story.
yeah, that it was appropriate for this story and when it came out, and the fact that we didn't have any like other Dark Jedi around to be present and his foil, etc. He
Hmm.
needs to be nerfed in some way to make this make sense, and
the
also big his
the,
own
the
presence
reason
up within the
it,
story.
if those things just happened in the story, it would be lame and lazy.
Mm,
A
Hmm.
lot of this stuff is tied together because of what they are. I mean, that's sort of Thrawn's reason why he does business with Talon Karrde, if you want to call it that way.
mm,
It's
Yeah,
I need these things because I know I'm going to start effing around with like some dark Jedi guy, and I'm also after Skywalker. It's like why? Of course, he's going to want access
of
to the
course.
one thing that does that. So the story it's a conceit of the story, but it's baked into the plot in a way that the characters are. It's not just happenstance. When shit like
Right.
this just happens, or it feels like out of nowhere or too
like a
convenient,
MacGuffin.
that's where people start. Yes,
Very
that's when
much
people
so.
start calling bullshit, but it doesn't really apply here unless you just purely don't like the idea of being able to create these force bubbles or push away the force, which some people don't.
And
Um,
that's fair.
but
I don't personally have that, but I
that's
think
a
that's a fair
perspective thing.
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It never
Um,
gets in the way of things, and the book very firmly establishes like the limitations. Like these things are only from this planet, and you can only move them if you go through this specific process. So it's natural enough to where it doesn't feel like just completely out of nowhere. So
I
it's
don't
all fine in itself. It's
It's
just
I don't
perfectly
like I
mind
said,
handled, yeah, within its own concept.
I don't I don't
but
mind
that's a
that.
point too. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say I don't mind aberrations as long as you're doing something with them.
Mm.
The
Hmm.
Vong don't manipulate the Force because the Force has severed them from it, because of how horrible they're basically like everything they're about is like,
And they're
kind
extra
of
galactic anyway, so is that little
yeah,
excuse as well?
antithetical, but it's antithetical to like life, the things that they
Mm.
do, or like what would be conceived, what would be conceptualized as like a good life, you know what I mean? So
Mm.
it's very much that they have been kind of exiled from being able to use the Force. And so as long as you're doing something intentional with your aberration, it's fine. Um, to bring up Darth Maul Shadowhunter again, at some point you meet this giant worm that's called like a Tauzen that doesn't feel the Force, or it can't be sensed in the Force. It also is just this weird thing like the Asalamirs that exists, and Maul bumps into us. Oh, I thought these were extinct. That's weird you know but I mean it's like but it's kind of it's like it's only there. The only reason why that's even there is, oh yeah, he can't sense it, so he can be surprised by it, but that's
Mm.
that's pretty much the only thing that in comparison is far lesser, like far less is being accomplished with that example. These are being put to use, so that's what's good about them
Absolutely.
And are woven, like you
And
said, so carefully
yeah.
into the story. Like it's not just
yeah.
Thrawn needs them, therefore they're there. It's not just because Luke needs to be contained, therefore they're there. It's not because Karrde needs to not
Hmm.
be able to have his base instantly beaten by Luke because they're part of the whole, not just plot but
Mhm.
story of the trilogy. So
Hmm.
he's done his due diligence basically to make it not a
Oh,
MacGuffin and perfectly
absolutely. Yeah.
fine. But again, if you don't
It's
like the concept, that's
yeah.
fine. You don't like the concept. There's nothing
Yeah.
anyone can do for that.
Yeah, it's not bad by any means, and I also like how it's a good chance of showing how capable Luke could be even without the Force. His ability,
Mm,
like the breakout scene, like we keep mentioning with the hand. Him using his knowledge of starfighters and repairing and altering technology and stuff. Things that were firmly established in the films. His cunning, his awareness of situations, the fact that he can still draw on Jedi disciplines of
his
mentality,
calm, his
himself
personality.
centered,
Yeah, he's a Jedi
which
without the
even though he
Force,
can't
which
feel the Force,
matters.
which all of that is fantastic, and it shows that like being a Jedi really is more than just being able to use the Force. And even
Mm,
then, like little like writing points, like I love the description when they're leaving the planet and the Force finally comes back to him. The description of that, and when Han asks him about it, he's like, "Oh, it's like, coming back to yourself after being blind, it's like,
Mm.
that it shows how integrated it is into him at this point, which is really, again, just good storytelling in terms of dialogue,
And I
Yeah.
want to say, again, these are ideas that were not mind-blowing to me at the time that I picked it up, but thinking about when it came out and what it represented to the world that met it, I mean, it's very, very, very powerful stuff because what you just were pointing out there, that's, well, it's not all she is about, but it's like 75% of what Freya, aka Darth Treya, talks about when she's training the Exile. So
Mm.
it's like kind of a, is that story as deep as it is just because those writers were asking those questions, or did part of what occurred to them to ask those questions in the first place come from stuff like this? It's so baked into not just like who she is as a character, but much of what she talks about from the beginning of that game to the end of it, and even before it becomes obvious why she's asking these questions or whatever, they bear a remarkable resemblance to everything you're just talking about there. And so it's like, even though you're just reading a short passage from the Thrawn trilogy, you can basically turn it into the not the entire, but a significant, building part of the building blocks of like one of the most well written antagonists slash Sith Lords. It's kind of limiting to call her a Sith Lord. She's more than that, but just one of the best, antagonists that we're ever going to get. She's asking these questions that are partially based on the sequence you're talking about, or sequences like those. So it's
I
really
think
good.
it, Yeah, I think it's also worth talking about, if you don't mind me talking about R2-D2 for a second. I
I mean, he's
No,
the
like
you
star of
can't
the
do that.
how
story.
You can't.
As we
We
always
can't
say.
talk about R2-D2.
I like yeah, I like that. Well, for one thing, I like how it firmly established their dynamic. Again, getting back to saying a lot in a little bit of dialogue, like
Mm.
like when Luke and Mara and R2 are going through the forest. I like that Mara keeps referring to R2 as it, whereas Luke keeps referring to him as he.
Mm.
Shows kind of their bond and their connection. And then also the fact that they firmly established that Luke wants to keep R2 as he is and therefore goes out of his way to make sure that he never gets his memory erased, which in turn allows him to integrate much more completely with his ship, which in turn leads to his ability to eventually contact Han and Lando later on in this sequence. Little
It's
little
going
things
back
like
to that
that,
cutting
interweaving
pieces up and
character.
extending them across the entire
Yeah.
plot and story. He takes the time to tee all these things up and lay it out. It's never just,
In,
oh, he's going to explain it all in one go. This allows him to make
yep.
finer tunes and without even help with coding from the very start.
It's
I
a
think that
very
might
smart,
be
smart way of using like little character touches to inform story beats later on. So that whole thing is I really enjoy that. Like, it's one of those things you didn't have to do in another book and at another time with a different author probably wouldn't have done. But, when it's here in the way that it is, it's very much appreciated. Also, and again, I'm just gonna bring this up. In hindsight, it's really good that Luke never decided to erase R2's memories, considering he knows everything that happened in the prequel era and all
well.
that. And eventually, much later in the story, he actually uncovers recordings of R2, from Revenge of the Sith, Anakin, Padme, and all that. So again, it's one of those things
I
in hindsight. It's really good you didn't erase him. Yeah.
Mm.
I always thought that there was a chance that that might have been one of those weird, seemingly random directives from Lucas, because no one ever does do the wiping of R2's memory, and even in Revenge of the Sith, I think it's specifically Organa is like wipe the protocol's memory, like at the
Mm.
end of Sith. I don't think they say anything about wiping R2's, so
They don't.
I think it's always been kind of just one of those weird things that Lucas insisted on, and like from the top down, it's kind of like you don't, for the longest time, you don't tell the story of the Clone Wars, you don't wipe R2's memory. Kind of, I think that that's one of those things. But I always
Yeah.
thought, and I've said this probably in some video we did like 9 years ago together, but I always thought that it would have made more sense if Anakin had built R2 rather than
Mm.
3PO, because
Agreed.
particularly because he's used as kind of like this, as many things, but kind of like this semi physical like legacy hand me down from father to son kind of a thing, but not in a way like Vader ever gave him to Luke. He just wound up with Luke, like I mean it feels like one of those it's meant to be will of the force kind of a
Mm.
things. And 3PO can't do anything useful for anyone, like me, you know what I mean? It's like what's he gonna do? He can't even sweep the floor. His arms don't move. So
but at least even
anyway,
within that legacy aspect, if you were going to choose a legacy, hand me down of the two, every single person watching these films or reading these stories would choose R2. I mean, he's the companion. He's the one that integrates with the two starfighter, aspects of the character.
yeah.
All things like that. He fits perfectly as that choice. So it just doesn't really work for it to be C-3PO, particularly because we know that he comes in the main original story from the Alderaan side of
And
things,
3PO has
which
his
is
mind wiped,
Padme's.
particularly so he can't be useful in this way.
Yeah, exactly. But
That kind of makes it pointless.
it just makes more sense for 3PO to come from the Padme Alderaan
She's a
side of
politician.
things.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
R2 to come
he would have
from
been with
Anakin.
Yeah.
I know obviously Padme came from Naboo before anyone mentions, but I mean specifically the line of Padme Naboo, Leia, Alderaan. Like the line connects.
Anybody who knows who we are that's going to point that out and act like you don't know that, he knows where they come from. You know what I mean? You get those gotcha comments every now and then, and it's just like, come on, guys, you think we don't know that? We're in our
Anyway.
30s. We might have known that before you were born, kind of a thing,
But yeah, little touches like that. So in the sequence, when they're going through the forest, is also when we learn about Mara's backstory, or at least parts of it. Her being the Emperor's hand, her having actually been in Jabba's palace undercover at the time of Return of the Jedi, with Jabba refusing to allow her on the sail barge, which of course led into the vision that Luke had.
Can we just make a point that once again that every single character in Star Wars was at some point in Jabba's palace? it's like the meeting place for every obscure character ever, or Tatooine in general, even for the prequel side. It just seems to be the focal point of the entire galaxy. This random know nothing dump of a planet.
As you do, but we get the context with the vision, as Matt said earlier, about that actually potentially being a potential past rather than a potential future, because she very clearly was there, and we get the first mention of the Emperor's hand, which was her position, and with that too, she's basically like this undercover spy who Sidious trained as a way of like handling things that other members of the Empire could not. And the fact that she was, working in the shadows meant that there were little to no records of her existence. So when the Empire, basically collapsed, or at the very least was fragmented after the Battle of Endor, well, she couldn't just go, and this is basically to explain why she couldn't just go back and serve Thrawn, because no one knew who she was, essentially. And it also explains part of her grudge towards Luke, because, essentially her whole world was destroyed. We do get more context for that later in the trilogy, her specifically, because there's also some mystical elements at play with Sidious essentially projecting into her head, "You will kill Luke Skywalker" on repeat, which has essentially driven her pretty upset by this point, understandably. So, yeah.
She's a character.
Characters like hers. Sorry, can I just say real quick? Yeah, characters like hers. It's always funny to say this because Star Wars is what it is, right? It's sort of a space fantasy world, and people have these fantastical careers like bounty hunter or smuggler or whatever. But you can kind of imagine most of them having like something like normalcy. And even when you're looking at some like Spider-Man takes the mask off sometimes and goes to school. He's Peter Parker, and sometimes he's on a date with his girlfriend or doing something for Aunt May or whatever. What is an Imperial hand doing? Like you know what I mean? Like without like somewhere to go back home to, it feels like the hero without the secret identity. And I think that that's a little bit like, I'm sure that she has depth, and everything. I don't want to say she's poorly rendered, but like when you brought her up earlier, the reason why I don't really jive with her, where else I might be able to, is just because it just feels a little bit like I said, like half of a character. It kind of feels like you don't see really what makes her a person fully,
And it's kind of by design for the concept of her character, like you said, the type that she represents. And I agree that I struggle to kind of fully connect with her until we do get that filled in later on, because she obviously is a character gets massive development throughout the rest of the year. She's one of the linchpins of the
She's a lot more interesting
later
on in the series.
Yeah, and she grows into that. But
and also
in doing
this
so, she steps away largely from
has been ripped off so many times. You know what I mean? Like there's too many of these now that it just isn't like a novel concept anymore. But that's not her fault.
Yeah,
far from it.
That being said, the parts that I love her the most in this are when she's with Karrde, when we're talking about her connection to the organization. Like when you get get a sense that she's kind of trying to find herself post that role as being Hand, even through what you said, Evan, with the screaming of the kill Luke, kill Luke, kill Luke in the back of her mind. She's a character that's struggling to redefine herself, and that isn't naturally interesting by itself. But when he's playing in that headspace for her, I'm the most engaged. I think that
I do like
you can see that he's got a trajectory for her, and her voice as well.
Yeah,
the character
voice.
The
character voice. There's one bit where the scene begins where it's like Mara decided once again, that she hated the galaxy or something like that because she was dealing with something that was annoying her at the time. It was one of those ways of being here we are again in my bullshit life. That's a fun line. So I don't actually dislike the character in any way. These are the things that impede her from being like a true favorite in the context of this book.
You could very much hear the eye roll in her dialogue.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I like as well that she has when she's thinking about Karrde in particular, the idea of the kind of debt to him, that she's writing, I don't have a debt to him. Like, it's a professional relationship. I've fulfilled my role to him, exactly as I should for what he's paying me effectively. This is a professional relationship, and it's two-way street, and it's been handled fine. There's no debt, but in all of her actions, it's clear that she feels some kind of personal debt to him and the organization. Like, she feels this is somewhere she wants to be. You can see it from all of the actions she's taking throughout the story. It's just never explicitly stated in her mind because she's not, it's either something she doesn't want to or hasn't yet faced, all while trying to work towards this being this new person that she is in this new world. I like that all of that, the way all that's handled, like what that's teeing up for her in the future. I love where she goes as a character in the New Jedi Order era. But yeah, just at the moment, she is very much that kind of starting archetype that you talked about, Matt, where if you don't resonate with that, she's not got much more to give at this stage. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. It comes off very peculiar in hindsight when you consider, like you were saying, how fleshed out she ends up becoming and how she really does become such a major player later on. Going back to this now, I was actually surprised how comparatively little she's in this book, because when I think of Thrawn Trilogy and I think of the quote unquote original characters that are introduced in this whole thing, I think of her as being one of them, but she's compared again. I'm just talking Heir to the Empire. She doesn't really have any major presence until the third act, which is fine. It was just something I was a little bit surprised about, because going back into it when I was thinking it was more of an even split. It really isn't. So that was something that kind of caught me a little bit by surprise. I think the way she is handled here is fine enough. Again, it's all just set up, but yeah, if this is your first introduction to her, which it was for quite a few people, I can see how I could definitely see how you might not resonate with her until more stuff comes along. Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike with Thrawn, you read Thrawn and it's oh, I want to know more, or oh, I at least understand where this guy could have come from. With Mara, it's not quite as strong, and you could say that some of that just has to do with the fact that she's just not in it as much as he is. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. But how she is handled here, I think is perfectly serviceable for what it is.
Yeah,
I
agree.
I mean, it's not like there's nothing poorly done about it. It's just I like some of his other work better in this book, but I mean, she's perfectly fine.
Before we move
I don't
on,
think there's anything terrible. You know what I mean? Is there any single thing that we just hate? I don't know if we've questioned that.
Not really, no.
Yeah.
Just little annoyances, some with continuity and some dialogue. I will say that I think the climax is probably one of the weaker points in the book. It's just not quite as...
I was about to shift us into that as a discussion, because that's obviously the last thing we need to discuss. But before we do, just the only two characters to come to mind that we haven't really talked about right now are Lando and Wedge. Wedge is Wedge, handled perfectly, does what he needs to do, all of that stuff. The same is pretty much true of Lando. But Lando I want to talk about just in the context of he's a perfect example of a character in this story that isn't just a background character, minor character, that also gets this treatment. But he's basically just carried by the fact that he's Lando, right? I mean, this is Lando as we see in the films, with the extra layer of development having been the fact that it's 5 years on from what we've seen in those originals. Voice is perfect, actions are perfect, fits the relationships of the characters. You see some of the textured backstory with Han. I really need to stop using the word textured, I apologise. It seems to be the crux for me this year. His backstory with Han is developed and shown in nice little glimmers throughout the story. I loved him in this. I'm not particularly a massive Lando fan, but for every ounce of me that likes Lando was fully stimulated by this book.
No,
Very well
I
handled.
agree. I think he's
Yeah, I
one of
think
the reasons why I really like the second book. There's a lot of him and Han
Mm,
unraveling the mystery of the Katana fleet together, and I think he gets the voices right on everyone,
yeah,
but someone like Luke, say, like without someone to bounce off of, isn't quite as much fun, just because Luke's so kind of polite and just good natured, and oftentimes he's off alone. That
very
it's not
calm as
boring. I don't
well.
mean that. Yeah, very
Mm,
calm. But I don't mean to say that there's anything wrong with that. But like you don't need to see like dialogue tags or to know who's talking whenever he's writing a Lando line. I mean, it
mm,
just it works so well. And while we're on the subject of this, the I don't know what was done in the previous editions. This book's probably had more audiobooks than most. The one that was done, the edition of it for the 25th anniversary, was narrated by Mark Thompson, who I think needs a shout out. I meant to mention this much earlier on than we did. Um, when he talks as Luke, he sounds like Mark Hamill. He sounds like Luke. He sounds like Han. He sounds like Billy D. Williams. He sounds like most of the characters that he could ever. I mean, obviously, he doesn't sound like Leia. Spoiler alert. But you know what I mean. It's like
but
anybody
yeah.
who he could, anyone who he could do like a credible impression of, he does a fantastic job. And I think that arguably Lando and Luke are the ones I'm most. I can kind of do like a Harrison Ford, but he does Lando really, really well. He does
Mhm.
Mark Hamill just talking as Luke, who's again at his calmest. Like it's hard to imitate somebody's natural speaking voice. You know what I mean?
mm,
That's what's most difficult. Anyone could do that, the power of the dark side, but actually sounding like Ian McDiarmid would be difficult. You know what I
mm.
mean? He can do just Luke, and he does Lando perfectly. So I just wanted to get that out there. Um,
And
I love Lando in these. Just to
Yeah,
tack on, I can't add to anything you just said other than he's great in these books.
I'm right there with you.
yeah, and I one of my favorite inner dialogue moments from him is when right before the final act takes place when they're in the city, and
Mm,
he goes like, and he's like contemplating whether or not to stop the ambush because Luke told them to. He has something along the lines of like, Lando realized he's at a crux where, should he trust cold hard facts or should he trust people?
mm.
And just the way that was written, you really, it's a perfect little encapsulation of a lot of the elements I felt from Empire Strikes Back, because it's very much the sort of split between does Lando, you know, go with what the Empire is doing in order to like keep on the straight and narrow with his city, or does he do what is right for his friends in that moment? And we know he ultimately chooses his friends. So it's a nice little. I think that's a nice little callback to that sort of dynamic without coming back as like a direct ham-fisted homage. So again, just I've said it a million times, the dialogue for all of these characters and the way it's written is just fantastic in this
It,
book.
it it really is. I keep saying it feels like that continuation of the originals. This is the natural sequel to the original stories, and I think that's the highest praise we can give, really. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, that I think covers all the characters, though.
Yeah, you were
Yeah.
wanting to move into a talk about just the way that the climax kind of
Yeah,
uh
you
Yeah.
felt that it
happens.
kind of let you down a bit, Evan, the climax compared to the rest
Um,
of the book.
it's not bad. I just feel like it's kind of hard. Again, it's kind of hard to really put in the words. Like there was all this sort of build up, and to me, it feels kind of not that I would want it to have been dragged out. I would have liked it if it was a bit more, if there was a bit more time dedicated to it, because to
Yeah.
me the final sort of battle felt very quick. Now, to be clear, I like how it every character essentially has their own contribution to it that
Mm,
ultimately leads into them succeeding. I like that it was very much a group effort, for them to win. And I also like that they win against Thrawn by outsmarting him. Very appropriate for this sort of situation and the perfect foil to what Thrawn has been built up as. At the same time, though, I just wish we had. Again, it's all presentation. I like the structure. I like the ultimate resolution. I just wish there was more to it. I wish we had more time seeing Thrawn, in his grid commanding things. I would have liked if there was a bit more of a push and pull dynamic where, Han doesn't just instantly come to this, revelation of the whole communications aspect to it. I would have liked a bit more build up to it. To me, it just felt a little quick. What it is fine, but I felt like with all the build up they've been having up until this point to this invasion, I don't know. To me, it just came off a little quicker than it should have. But
So
that's
I
just me.
think
so
that
I
I think
completely.
the sequence. Sorry, I
Sorry, you
think
go
the
first, Matt.
sequence was. I think the sequence was almost not there at all. I think that the book originally was going to end a little bit before this even began, and he was told, "No, you have to go out on a more
Big space
exciting
battle.
note."
Climactic note,
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
missing a big space
yeah,
battle from this film
and
or
so
book.
and so I don't think that it comes off as like a true afterthought. I wouldn't panic quite that, you know, aggressively, but definitely it feels I don't know, like a second pass was probably in order. Like it feels like he laid down the track. He got it there so that the train's not going to go off rails, but it doesn't quite maybe go as smoothly as we want it to, you know. I think it was definitely like a later stage development kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
But
I
you know,
really I really enjoyed it, but I agree with you, Evan and Matt, that it feels a little bit rushed. It's not so much that it doesn't deliver within its own pacing; it's the fact that you expect it to be more going in, and that kind of leaves that kind of lingering, question of the expectation
kind
not
of
being fulfilled.
kind of
Because
Captain Pellaeon is expecting more than what ends up happening
yeah,
as well, you know.
yeah.
So
yeah, it's
yeah.
the way it's set up. Like you said, I mean, there's not so much push and pull. Where that is there, it feels like it could have been set up more and more artfully included. I was thinking about this earlier. I think that part of the solution to that is, how much focus was put on the lack of sensory input and lack of the everyone being blind on the previous planet with Mercia. I think the solution to kind of everyone's quick reaction to, we can use the comms to solve this. I think the natural bridge to make that feel more natural is that the fact they're so aware of the fact they've been blind and deafened this entire time, the fact that they're not now, you could have layered that in a little bit more as a thing that brings to attention that solution more rapidly. Because the way it's handled with Han kind of like, there's something in the back of my head that could be useful here. That didn't feel quite as graceful as it could have done. I do like, though, I mean, your point about how they outsmart Thrawn, excellent. It makes sense for a character like him to be outsmarted as part of his foil. But the thing I like about it more than anything else is it in no way underscores his competence. Because all of the things they're bringing to the table here, blind luck. They're utilizing their skill sets and their talents, but the fact that all these people are here, luck. The fact that all these people have the knowledge they have right now, luck. The fact that that the timing of things, like the fact that Luke just released by Karrde, an aspect of or a piece on the board that Thrawn had influence over and mishandled through perfectly reasonable reasons. Luck. This was kind of a perfect storm to undercut and outplay Thrawn that they didn't
There's no
really
such thing as
bring.
luck, Alan.
Oh yeah, of course. Aside from the fact there's no such thing as luck, it was a living force fighting Thrawn. But yeah, the fact that he did everything right and playing things out as he planned, everything would have gone his way. I mean, and that's shown by the fact that the Han's plan initially is of trying to counter to get some of the assets back on their side. You're trying to destroy the engines and stuff. The fact that's all failing, it's shown. The only reason they succeed is Lando happened to be part of the story and happened to wake up and confirm, oh yeah, I have the codes for this. It's all of this is set up, but it feels like that perfect storm of luck that counters Thrawn. It's not just something that he's not made a mistake. He's not been wrong for forecasting so strongly that this was going to be an overwhelming victory, etc. And it also doesn't feel like Deus Ex Machina at any point, because Lando doesn't jump in out of hyperspace and go, I'm here with the codes to help you. He was there. He's been a part of the story. Everything's integrated, like we were saying with the Salamari. It's not. This has all been laid out, and he's done the due diligence to make it work. It just feels, compared to the stretched out time spent on all of the other aspects of the story, it feels like this is coming at you very quickly, and not really giving the finale time to breathe.
Yeah, like I said, structurally everything works perfectly fine and works, I think, as it should for this specific situation. It's just like it would have been like we keep saying, it would have just been better it needed a bit more of a slow burn, in terms of presentation, and the fact that they I would have hammered it in more, the fact that they're all contributing in very specific ways, and all of these factors coming together are what ultimately lead to their victory. Just a bit more emphasis on that in the writing, little things like that, and it's perfect. That's literally all it needs. I think for what it is, it's by no means boring by any stretch.
Oh yeah.
It just needs a little. It just could have benefited from a little bit more. But
Content wise, by the
um,
way, I also want to note that the plan is interesting. Like the assets being used, the way they're being used, the nature of the tactical decisions and the
yeah,
kind of calculus behind it. That's all very well handled. It never bores you at any point, never goes in too much depth, but you can see that there was a specific plan and an order to this, which you need to sell a character like Thrawn. It can't just be half-assed and like they casually throw out some military terms and then bam, they go. This was well thought
right,
out and had specific goals in mind with specific tools being used in specific ways, etc. And
yeah,
it only went wrong again because of all the blind luck that kind of went the rebellion, the New Republic's way.
yeah. I
hmm
was going to say that to be honest, I don't really focus on this because there are books that I like more than this one that I think have much worse endings. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Or endings that even if they're not bad, they are still, in my opinion, rushed. We're not going to talk about it for some time, but Shatterpoint, I think, is an amazing book. I think the ending of that is quite rushed. It's just there are other instances that I could point to that where I think a more egregious rush is involved at the end.
Mm.
Books that I overall prefer, that I will make a bigger deal out of it than this. And there are other books that I liked more when I was growing up that I don't like as much as this one upon reflection. Um, there's a hint, like I'm not,
One that's
you
to
know,
come.
yeah, we'll discuss
yes,
it soon.
Yeah, it's
But
by
yeah,
no
but
means something
I
that
think
the book needs to be lambasted for sure. It's just it's like a
yeah,
minor tweaking I'd do to kind of help refine it.
yeah,
Yeah, it's by
Mhm.
no means a bad ending for sure.
yeah. And then we, after the Empire, pulls back, we catch up with, the our main characters, and we end on somewhat of a cliffhanger moment where we learn that Akbar has been arrested for treason, which, leads to, because obviously this goes back to like, Phalia's influence. I do really appreciate the fact that when Luke is like, what do we do? And Han says, he essentially just says, we'll figure it out on the way, more or
Mm.
less. He
Never
doesn't
tell
say
me
that
the odds.
exactly, but that's, again, a very Han line. So,
It,
that's a pretty good truncation to all this.
I've only read this book once before, and it was about 17 years ago, if not more. So I can't actually remember the context of this. I don't remember what went wrong to cause Akbar being arrested for treason. So I'm curious to see where this goes. So it's the only part of the plot
Yeah.
and the story that I've forgotten in that time. Yeah,
Well,
I
on
can't recall
that
what that's
note,
about. So looking forward to seeing that with the rest of
Yeah.
this trilogy to come, which we will also be
I was
talking about.
I, yeah, we will talk about the rest of it, but we're not talking about the next one next because
Mm.
one of the things that I think is helping us is the ability to kind of delve into different topics, and kind of not always be feeling like we're anchored to one subject. So we will finish the entire Thrawn trilogy and probably get eventually to things like Outbound Flight and
Mm.
other works that involve him. Maybe some people want us to talk about canon for some reason. Maybe someday we'll talk about what's happened there. Granted, I think he's probably fared better than most any other character in terms of like, what's going on with canon.
Oh, for sure.
Or
Yeah.
not
Right.
maybe most any, but there's quite a few characters that I don't know have been done worse by than him. But
Luke
I
Skywalker
don't
for
even know
one.
why people want us to know. Like, I don't even know what people want us to say about any of that, yeah, really, to be honest. But we keep getting asked about canon. It's not, at least in my opinion, it's not something I'm making a point of ignoring. I just don't care. Like, it never really have.
Yeah, not
Um,
Yeah.
gravitating
but
towards it.
It's just not
but
interesting.
we'll see. I am actually looking forward to a canon book, or I can't tell if it's one book or multiple, but they're doing a line of books based off of uh what they've done with Andor. So not a retelling of Andor in book form, I don't mean, but like the character of is it Luthen or Luthian? Luthen? The
Um,
Stellan Skarsgård character.
Mm.
Um he's like a perspective he's got a book coming out that I will definitely be interested in
Interesting.
reading. But I'm not sure. It's him and Mon Mothma, and I'm like, hell yeah, I'll read a book about
Oh
them. But I'm
yeah.
not sure if it's. I'm not. There's also, but the third one in the trio is the Saw Gerrera character who I could
Oh
take
yeah,
or
don't care
leave.
about him.
But I can't tell if it's one book with those three alternating perspectives or if it's a Luthen book, a Mon Mothma book, and then a Saw Gerrera book.
Mm.
Either way, I will dip into it just for whatever is being told there because Andor is so great. I saw a couple of comments in our recent videos kind of slagging it, and I'm like, Did
Yeah,
you
I
guys
don't understand that
watch
one. Did
Andor?
you watch that?
Yeah,
And the other shows
Yeah,
that are coming out at the moment? But yeah, well,
fantastic.
people, it would
yeah,
have been interesting to see people's perspectives on it when we do
Honestly,
eventually cover it, because we are
yeah,
definitely covering Andor and season 2 when it comes out as well, because we love
yeah,
that series. But yeah, what
absolutely.
Matt's saying, we're not going to be going straight for book 2. I mean, necessarily, it
mm-mm.
might happen that way, but I doubt it.
We're
We've
not.
got
No,
other
no, no. We
things
have
to
other
cover
things. Yeah,
that we're more
Yeah,
interested in
yeah.
more
but
urgently.
it's
So
on the
we'll come back
docket.
to
Well,
this soon. It will be
yeah,
soon, though. It's not going on the back burner forever. It'll be like maybe a
Mhm.
month or two delay compared to next week, as it would otherwise be.
hmm
But yeah, that's pretty much everything we have to talk about with this book, right? I mean, there's the
yeah. I mean,
summation is just the
it's a
characters
Yeah,
reacting and saying what's going to
it's
come.
a fantastic.
I will note, I like, sorry, just a very small piece, it doesn't need a lot of coverage, but Thrawn's response to the failure and his reaction was perfectly executed for his character. It wasn't a surprise, but it was perfectly executed for who he is, and helped sell the competence angle. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's all I have to say on this book now at the moment.
yeah. No, it's good. It's like, I mean, this is history. Like this is a piece of history, and despite certain quibbles that we've had with it, it's a fantastic read, and it led to a lot of just absolutely amazing things that we still enjoy to this day. And it still stands on its own as a very, poignant and entertaining piece of science fiction literature, and we all appreciate that.
yeah. I don't view most of Star Wars books as like real literature. I think a lot of it is kind of pulpy and just kind of fun, kind of B grade stuff. But there are a few books that I think transcend, and this is a candidate on that list. There's out of the hundreds of books that there are, maybe there's like a couple dozen that I think are actually like actual literature. Um, this one is this one I think is worthy of it. I don't love it as much as I don't have as a personal relationship to it as I do other works. But I don't want that statement to detract at all from the quality of what is going on here. It's a really, really well produced work. And I want to say, because I think we forgot to mention it after we hit the record button, we discussed this before. One very possibly a junior partner in this, but somebody with a big role to play was the person who gave it its name, because Timothy
Yes,
Zahn was
yes.
going to call it. He was going to call it what was it? The war leader's gambit, or the
Warlord's Gambit.
warlord's
Yeah.
gambit. Nobody would be talking 30 something years later about Warlord's Gambit without like at least a hint of embarrassment, you know what I mean? And then his other idea was Wild Card, which wouldn't have been as iconic, but it does at least make sense in the context of this, that being Talon Karrde's chip. But the name, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Lou
Warlord,
Aronica from
Warlord Gambit and Wildcard are correct. Yes.
Yeah.
yeah. But Lou Aronica from Bantam Books, at least at the time, I don't know if he's still there or whatever, but he's the one who proposed the title of Heir to the Empire, which is so much better. And in and
And
of
we thank him
itself is
for it.
just we do, and it's just that in itself is a bit of a literary achievement. I mean, it's got that alliterative, so the Heir to the Empire, it sounds good, I mean, and it fits so much better, not just Thrawn, but also the character, the character of Thrawn, yes, but just the symbol of trying to construct a new galactic order in the wake
Hmm.
of this vacuum. I mean, what is going to be the new status quo? What is going to be the new government? What is going to be life as we know it from here on? It's just such a better title, and it wouldn't have come from Timothy Zahn. It's one of the few great ideas in this that did not belong to him, and I didn't want us to go without. And he himself credits
Hmm.
Lou with that. So we need to join him in that praise. But yeah,
Well,
this is a wonderful book, and it was nice to look at it again. I'm sure it won't be the last time that I read it in my life, but we got a lot of other things to get to as well. So
Hmm.
thanks so much. I'm having a lot of fun going through these again. So I'm glad everybody's had that resurgence of
Likewise,
like the Star
yeah.
Wars spirit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the best thing about this, the fact that I'm actually enjoying Star Wars again. And as I've said many times, this is the sequels to the originals. So, thank you very much, Timothy Zahn, for giving it to us. But that has been our analysis of Heir to the Empire, first book of the Thrawn Trilogy. More to follow soon, both Star Wars and otherwise. I am Callan, and I still don't have an outro.
This is Matt. Thanks for watching, guys. May the force be with you.
Evan Nova 95. We hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you guys later.
Goodbye.